2017 vintage stacked up in comparison with those. So if you will, please join me in applauding Rob Davis. Thank you.
Well, it indeed is a privilege to be here with such an esteemed group here. Many of you I know. And I was in India when Mark called me up for a wedding, and it's a completely different culture, and he talked to me about 2017. I said, you don't want me to talk about 2017, 12, 13, 14, even 15, 16, absolutely, but not 17. He goes, no, that's what we want to hear. So I'm going to start with the bright side, because 2017, like any vintage, I am very optimistic, and I think, oh, this is going to be a great vintage. We really had some amazing vintages previous to 2017. But particularly what marked 2017 going into it was the record rains that we had. I mean, we were coming off 5 years of drought. And this is just information on Santa Rosa Plain. You could probably add, well, our fruit, I should begin with. Our fruit that we get, the Chardonnay comes all from the Russian River Valley. Our Cabernet primarily comes from Alexander Valley with a little bit of Dry Creek and up in Mendocino. But after 5 years of drought, with the amount of rain that we got, it was really a blessed thing. Governor Brown finally officially called the end of the drought. So you can look at, I'm a cyclist, among other things, and when I go up to Rock Pile, I take these pictures of Lake Sonoma. This was in 2015. You can see how far the lake is down. And then this is 2017, and it was 125% water capacity. It was about as full as you can get, and the release rate was very, very high. But this is significant of just how much rain we had that year. What also was unique about the amount of the record rains, there really wasn't a lot of flooding, but this was one exceptional time when the Russian River, this is by the crossing of Russian River at Alexander Valley coming from Jimtown. And then if you were, this is really unique too, that they have wildflowers every year around the Carrizo Plain National Monument, around San Luis Obispo, Paso Robles area, but particularly with the amount of rain we had, I mean, the flora was just, the wildflower was just incredible. So this graph is probably the main one that I think really focuses on why 2017 was so unique. So you have, let's see if I can, so we started out, I mean, these are not that significant high ranges coming into the spring. But this one here I think is significant because of the Father's Day weekend. The vines were going through rapid cell division. Clusters were being formed in terms of size. I remember 2005 at that same time, we had 6 inches of rain, and literally our cluster weights doubled in size. It was incredible. But that particular time was really hot and not a great time you want to have a lot of heat. But then the rest of the story of the vintage is then you have coming into the 4th of July weekend, another 107 degrees. Now, these are Santa Rosa temperatures. You could probably add at least 5 to 8, maybe 10 degrees, depending on where you are in Alexander Valley. So you're looking at really, really intense heat. And then following that, if that wasn't enough, then kind of cooling period. But then we had, going into Labor Day weekend, we went 102 degrees, 110 degrees. There was no refuge at all where you could go to. You can go to the coast, and it was still as a 95. This particular day, when it was 110 here in Santa Rosa, I was on my way to look at some Chardonnay in Russian River, and I turned on the baseball game, and I heard Dwayne Kuiper announcing the game. It says 7:05, first pitch, 101 degrees here in AT&T Park. Incredible to have that degree of temperature. In fact, he was telling me that a lot of that time, September, that's when a lot of the AAA players come up, and they could not find any kind of vacancy in a hotel within 25 miles of San Francisco. And the reason why is because all the locals who don't own air conditioning were actually occupying those hotels. So, and as we recovered, we came back from the holidays. For those who were not working on that weekend, then you again got hit by another heat spell. And I think what this added up is just vines. This is what I'm thinking really interesting to hear in the speakers today. Vines can only take so much, and they will abort their fruit just in self-preservation. And each time this is happening, I think the incidences I saw, the response of the vines in preserving their own characteristic, own physiology to make sure they could live for the next year. And from a winemaking point of view, the loss was our own fruit. So you can't see the picture very well on the bottom, but what we do for our growers, we go through springtime after fruit is set, and we go through and we count every vine, every tenth vine, every 10th row. And then I look at the standard deviation. If it's greater than 10 clusters per vine variance, then we'll go through and we'll do every 5 vines, every 5 rows. But we want to get a good count to see just what the crop size is. And that way my estimate is that I break down in terms of, I know how many vines in the whole block. And then the difficult part of estimating crop size is finding what the cluster weight is. And I'm looking at, in terms of what the clusters are looking at after berry set, if they're full, if they're loose, and then trying to figure out how many pounds per cluster might be. But then the final analysis, when we get close to harvest, we do sampling. Normally right before we make the decision, we literally pick on taste. So as we sample the vines, our sampling is similar to the cluster counting. We sample one cluster every 10th vine, every 10th row, and we bring that in and we crush it up and we taste it, but we also measure the cluster weights, and that cluster weight is pretty, we're within a day of picking, so that cluster weight then is recorded and logged year after year. So you're seeing here that just Chardonnay was 23% down on the cluster weights we were bringing in 2017 from the normal triamine I run about 0.31, it was 0.24, which is very small for a Chardonnay cluster. And you can see here just how loose these clusters are, how many berries are missing here. And my observation is that when I see something like that, particularly with the amount of heat that we had at the Father's Day weekend, I think that's one of the responses we were seeing in the vines. Cabernet clusters, we also measure those, certainly like just a Chardonnay, we don't change the way we do things, one varietal versus the other. We still do cluster counts in the Cabernet, but we also measure the cluster weights before we pick them. And as the numbers came in, I started looking at it, and I thought, well, gosh, there's really no difference from the norm because we have like a 20-year average on a lot of these blocks. But what I found, though, was that, and I should have thought this right away, but a lot of the clusters that were not counted were the ones that had no weight at all. Those are the ones that were aborted fruit. And on 80% of our fruit is mechanically harvested, 20% is hand. The hand harvest, we send a crew through beforehand to drop any fruit that we want so it's not picked, but still some comes through. But if you look at the clusters were left behind, and I'm guessing on the average about 20% were left behind, there was hardly any weight in those at all. So overall, we saw, it was just 2017 I defined as a year of just loss after loss after loss. And we have the Chardonnay overall 20 to 30% down, varying on block as tons per acre. And then on press yields, we're also down because our press yields are all done by taste. In the old days where we used to press, and we didn't leave the pumice, you didn't discard the pumice until you got every drop out. But all of our decisions made on the press are done by taste. So once, and I count, I've got an associate winemaker and assistant, and they rotate on doing the press cuts, and I would come in from the vineyard and say, you're going to see something unusual this year, bitterness. Bitterness we don't normally see. We see astringency, but not bitterness. But because of the amount of heat, the succession of heat that we saw time after time, Father's Day, July 4th, going to Labor Day weekend and following that, and I was tasting out in the field the bitterness developing in the fruit. And it's something very, very difficult to remove as a winemaker. The best thing you can do is reduce it by not allowing it to come through on the press. The same thing with the Cabernet. We're varying anywhere between 10 to 30% down as tons per acre, and these are growers that we've been working with for 15, 20 years. The press yields also were down by about 5%. Our total press, we get about 10% total of the whole amount of wine we get out of a tank. So we even cut our press in by half. So when Mark asked me, and I said, have you ever seen a year like 2017? I said, the only one that scared me, literally, I still wake up nightmare sometimes when we get the harvest is 1996. I've never seen a year like 1996. In Alexander Valley, we had right at veraison. I think the timing was so essential in 96. Right at veraison, we had 4 days over 114 degrees, and the fifth was 110, and literally almost half our crop was aborted. And this is what we saw. This type of, oops, this type of, sorry. This type of shriveling. And a lot of the growers that I talked to, and these are experienced growers, they go, why aren't you picking your fruit? Because they're raisining. And one notable grower said, you got raisins in your mouth. And I said, no, they're not raisins. It's aborted fruit. Taste it. There's no sugar there. There's no flavor at all. It's aborted fruit. And it just, what I saw, if there was a graph I could put, which was difficult to do, but it's my head, that every time as we got close to harvest, there was a heat spike, there was the vine would express more aborted fruit. So it just, the process continued throughout 2017. So here you can see 2017. Again, 96, 2017, very similar process that's going on. And this is the example of the hand harvest when the hand harvest crew, it's very difficult to have a hand harvest crew go through beforehand and drop what's desiccated fruit, because you can turn the cluster around and that's where you see the desiccation, but some of it looks good. So some of it's always left behind for the hand pickers. So we have a conveyor that we normally have 2 people on the conveyor. We put 4 on it this year just to remove some more of this, so it didn't go through into the fermentation. Sensory properties of the wine, as you can expect, more losses. It just wasn't a quantity loss, it was a quality loss. The Chardonnay, what I love about Rush River Chardonnay is this beautiful Fuji apple. We tend to pick on the early side because we love acidity and it really expresses a lot of the fruit characteristics, but we just don't have the intensity, and I don't think you'd expect it without amount of heat. But what we did get is amount of not only heightened astringency, we always get a little bit of astringency, but we pick all of our fruits picked at night, just and very, very cold. The key is pick it as cold as possible, so when we bring in the fruit in, we get minimal amount of astringency. But even then, when we cut our Chardonnay in 3 lots. The first lot is the regular juice is about 10% of the whole juice that comes in just from the fruit as we process it, as it goes through the screw and we process it. We take that off, and it's good juice. It's just a little on the dirtier side, with a little more bentonite to kind of clean it up, and a little bit of casein. Free run we normally don't touch at all, but then the hard press, it's literally just by a decision that we all make when we taste it. We don't. A little casein is a milk protein, which you all know, but it's really wonderful at reducing the color, but for our style also reduce astringency. But the Cabernet also, I went through all the tanks right before we did the blend, and when I smelled and tasted them all, they just didn't have any black fruit characteristic. 12, 13, 14 were vintages that were just unbelievably cassis characteristics. They were just blackberry characteristics. But 2017, I just got more of the red fruit characteristic that just wasn't really intense. And then on our press lots, we still, as much as we try to be very liberal on our decisions on cutting the press, we still got this hard kind of simple structure tannins that I don't think, it's very difficult to build a wine on those tannins. It's more of a distraction to the palate, so it's something we want to kind of clean up. So, I'm looking at this in terms of talking with the growers, and like I'm talking to you, so okay, well, what worked and what didn't work in 2017? The question we have here is this 2017 an aberration, or is this something we can expect? I thought 96 I'd never see again, but 2017 came along, and I would hazard the guess that we might see another year where we have as much heat as we did in 2017. But I saw some more I call success stories of growers and some that didn't work out as well. There was a vineyard literally right next to each other, divided by a row, planted at the same time, same rootstock, different irrigation program. One came off very nicely, and the other, they lost about half their fruit. So I think what I saw mostly, if I was going to make a generalization, is that those growers in Alexander Valley particularly, but also in Dry Creek and even in Mendocino, those blocks, and we have extensive soil research we've done on these, every single one of these blocks, as well as MDVIs and other analysis, and we have little tooling monitors as well. So that's something we looked at, and what we found is that those that have more of what I call a 2-meter profile. We're far more successful keeping the vine physiologically active than the ones that had a very, very short profile and a smaller root zone. So the other thing is controlling excess cover crop. One of the growers was organic and was trying to devigor part of his vine by having a cover crop, and it actually devigored it so much though that he lost half his fruit there. So, and then the 03916, my experience there, a lot of growers now are using that to replant because of the resistance to Zymphanium index. That is a rupestris rootstock, is deep rooted, and in years like 2010, you really, really need to give it a lot of water. Oh, and then lastly, I think this is something that we can look at in the future of installing what's called microjets and micro sprinklers, misters. And what's important for the vine throughout this time, anytime you get a heat spike, is to keep the leaf surface cool. And this is something that we might want to be looking at down the future. Trellising, I'm not going to hit this much, but I did see VSPs were not as successful just because the more exposure of the fruit to the sun. And then harvest decisions, like I said, we don't pick on bricks necessarily, we pick on flavor, but like I said, some of the situations with the growers were that they really thought that we were picking, we were waiting to pick raisins, and that was not the case. Again, mechanical harvesting, the Pellenc particularly, and I'm not a salesman for it, but we have the Corvan and the Pellenc, but the Pellenc's been very, very amazing, and that you can dial it in for the fruit zone, and literally it would leave the majority, almost 90% of the desiccated fruit was left behind. And then I'll get into this later. Winemaking. So I always say this: the winemaker can only mask the errors of the vineyard, not repair them. So in Chardonnay, what can you do in situations? This is a winemaker. So what we found is that reduction of press yields is one, because that's the source of your stringency and bitterness, particularly. Casein, as I mentioned before. And then this year particularly, we normally do batonnage for about a 2-month period, 6 to 8 weeks. But this, we did not do at all. When I tasted the lees and the barrel fermentation, it was, there you see the effect of what spent yeast cells can do on bitterness, but it really removed a lot of that bitter component. But then on the other hand, in terms of batonnage, I didn't want to keep stirring that up. So we racked off very early on that. And then there is a component, one of our sponsors for this great group, there's a product called Eno Lees, which that was clean lees, and we've been using that to help remove some of the bitter components with moderate success. So cool fermentations we practice instead of hot, because the hot fermentations, when you get a cap over 90 degrees, you're going to extract much more of the hard tannins and more of the bitter components. Years like 12, 13, 14, great years, you're going to maximize some of the flavor extractions of those really rich tannins, but a year like that, you want to run a cooler fermentation. Then we did a little pre-barrel gelatin fining, about a pound per 1,000 gallons, just to drop some of the bitter components of the press wines. And then I'm really curious to see, because many of you here use French and American oak, or one or the other. We used to use both. We've now just gone to French oak because it complements our tannin profiles better. American oak we found is a wonderful, it's a more aggressive oak, but it's also very well defined, and a lot of people like it, but it's also wonderful masking some physiological defects in maturity. And then last all is, when when the harvest is over and I go, finally, I can just start to relax. This is, start looking for 2018. And then we finished that Saturday. That Sunday night, I was waking at 2 in the morning to evacuate my house. I looked up and just saw this orange glow. And granted, 90%, and here you can see, it seemed like just the whole north coast there was on fire, but also it shows you that there was no refuge. People wanted clean air, were going to go to the coast, and you just got smoke on the coast as well. So you're going to touch on smoke taint, and I was not going to say very much about that, except that the good thing is that most everybody was finished for the harvest before the fires. The problem for us, and this is where we found with extended maceration in a year like this, is not the thing to do. And I kind of anticipated that, so we were pressing early on all our lots, but because of the smoke and inhalation issues with even, within our fermentation room was enclosed, but even the smoke, the ambient smoke coming in, It was unhealthy for the workers, so we had to wait for the yard to come clean. So we just had to keep the tanks closed up, and we came back and pressed them off. And what a difference! There was just not the same elegance in the press wines, or even the free run for that matter, after they extended the maceration. So overall, as I'm going to finish up, 2017 was just, I define as just a year of losses of both quality and quality. But there's always next year. There's always good news, because we got an even year. And I was talking to Bruce Bochy, and I was telling him, he goes, how was your year? And I go, Bruce, I can't imagine a worse year. And he goes, talk to me about that. He says, we almost had 100 losses. He says, but we got an even year coming up. So this is 2018. There's got optimism as we approach this finish. Thank you all.
Thank you, Rob. I am Thibaut, and I will be moderating the different talks today. So in order to frame and articulate the different considerations, we essentially focused on 3 axes that are going to pace the speed at which maturation occurs. The first axis is the one that we've discussed together with Mark, is focusing on vineyard and environment, or better said, how the environmental stresses, whether looking at soil conditions or atmospheric conditions, are modulating vineyard performances in terms of biomass production, but also in terms of photosynthesis activity. Then the second axis is focusing on the relationships between plant and fruit maturation. We know that the footprint of environmental stresses is going to upregulate or downregulate genetic activation of maturation. Therefore, it's completely logical to expect that the history of plant stresses early season should impact late season the chemical composition of the fruit. And that will be discussed by Nicolas Bernard and Tori Harvik. And then, because at the end of the day we are growing fruit, not plant, it's important to understand how the food characteristics will drive different choices in terms of winemaking, and this will be discussed with our panels of winemakers. Also, with the same idea to frame the discussion and logically articulate cause, consequences, or carryover effects, we slice the season into 5 steps, and we've been doing that slicing everywhere, whether we look at the plant response in Burgundy, in Oregon, or in Southern California. Essentially, those 5 different colors corresponds to key stages that are setting up the pace at which the plant is preparing the next stage. So during the phase 1, essentially from leaf fall to bud break, the vine is dormant, and there is a lot of plant sensitivity towards heat and moisture control. So even if the plant is dormant, it's still sensing some environmental signals. Phase 2 is essentially the one that starts from bud break and ends when a leaf area peaks. And from phase 2 to phase 3, we are in this sweet spot, typically middle of June, middle of July, during which stresses, deficit of nitrogen, deficit of water, or even disease pressure, will drive what's happening during phase 4, which is now looking onto the fruit. So phase 3 ends at veraison, and phase 4 ends at the end of active sugar loading. So for those of you who are not very familiar with this concept, Nicolas will discuss it. And phase 5 is really this refinement of berry skin composition after technological maturation has been reached. And by technological, I meant sugar and acids, or in other words, the primary metabolites. Once they have been acquired by the fruit, what's left is the polishing of the tannins, the copigmentation, and all those tannin size reduction or modulation that happens during phase 5, which is where harvest decisions are most impactful. And to keep on discussing according to this timeline, we have a battery of plant indices that we can monitor the variations thereof in order to understand earlier on the footprint of the season. Typically, during phase 1, we can look at wood indices such as shoot number, shoot diameter, or the fusion of the both, which is the wood index. During the phase 2, we can look at the speed at which leaf area unfolds. During the phase 3, it's time to look at when nitrogen accumulation is peaking. It's time to look at how the combined effect of light interception with leaf area development sets up the total amount of water the plant can use, which is the KCB max, which we will be discussing. And then during stage 4, we can look at the speed at which sugar accumulates as a way to differentiate different vintages. And during stage 5, we reach the peak of color, and we will see how we can use that information, looking at the time profile, to further refine the positioning of harvest. So in order to keep that time frame, we are going to intertwine Mark Greenspan and I, our conversation. So we will talk about period 1, 2, and 3 together. And then we will move on to stage 4 and 5 to focus more on the fruit. So with that being said, what it is we're going to be seeing. So essentially, I'm using here the slicing of Sonoma into the distinct regions where we have networks of environmental sensors looking at global radiations or vapor pressure deficit or wind speed, rain amount. And what I have been doing, instead of showcasing each region separately, I've been looking statistically at the trends coming from those different regions. And after looking at the statistical distribution, I have simply chosen to show you the higher and the lower groups of patterns. So obviously, we don't have a dense network of weather stations in each and every region, but it should give you a good idea of the trends. And with that in mind, let's look first at what drives the explosion of vegetation at the beginning of the season. It's temperature accumulation and water supply. So if we focus on period 1 and 2, from a rain standpoint, the wettest area we've been able to identify are Dry Creek, Knights Valley, and Alexander Valley. So those top 3 regions were the ones that received the greatest amount of water. So you see we are above 1,200 millimeters of water, with Dry Creek showcasing the highest amount. But what I'd like to hint at is, even if we know it's a footprint of the year to have had a lot of water, look at what happened in the less wet area. You see that Carneros, Chalk Hill, and Sonoma Coast, depending upon where you were collecting water, were having still a lot of water, but significantly less than Sonoma. And that's already what makes Sonoma vintage characterization extremely difficult, because even looking at rain distribution, we see an extremely heterogeneous patterns, which means that we will have to adjust our appreciation according to site specificities. So lots of heterogeneity between appellations, you see, from 600s to 1600s millimeter. So in conclusions, when we are going to try to decipher the potential for growth, the potential for high yield or quick maturation, we need to know that what's going to drive the shoot elongation rate is not going to be limited by water. It's going to be limited by temperature accumulation, nitrogen accumulation, or disease pressure. So because of that, let's now look at heat accumulation by looking at temperature profile cumulated, again, over all the regions, but slicing the high heat accumulation sites into 2 categories. So you see here the categories of the rapid accumulation sites, with Dry Creek and Knights Valley being on the top of it. And you see that those guys are typically seeing during period 2, so the period that goes roughly from bud break to the solstice, March 1st, June 21st here. And obviously, if you have no moisture deficit, when you have a faster heat accumulation profile, you expect the plants to, according to the civil calendar, growing faster. On the other side of the spectrum, the lowest heat accumulation areas were Sonoma Coast and Russian River with barely 400 growing degree days accumulated. So with this simple approach, looking at heat and rain, we can come up with our first take-home of the day. There will be 6 take-homes. But the first one is that during period 2, so the period during which we have this explosion of biomass, growing degree days accumulation is very similar to 2016. So the speed at which things unfold should be following the same pattern. But we need to acknowledge that there is a very strong heterogeneity. Warmest areas being Dry Creek Nights, followed next by Chalk Hill and Alexander Valley. And we know that doesn't mean only an earlier leaf area development in warmer areas. What's going to be more interesting to start factoring in is that the speed at which leaf area develops also drives the speed at which nitrogen is being accumulated into the leaf area, which directly drives the timing of your assessment for nitrogen or nutritional needs, and also the timing of your corrective actions, which I will discuss later. Since nitrogen and water are expected to be non-limiting, we had a lot of moisture in the soil, so therefore a lot of microbiological activities to convert nitrogen mineral into plant-available nitrogen. We expect, simply based upon this simple climatic characterization, that a larger transpiring leaf area should be produced. We will see if it is true based upon a general assessment, but before diving into that general assessment, it's my pleasure to invite Mark to have, through his eyes, a more practically focused presentation. So Mark will come discussing period 1 to 3. I will come back and Mark will discuss period 4 to 5. So Mark, thank you for being there with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Thibaut and Mark, for inviting me, for one. I don't have as many slides, but let's see, where am I? Okay. So yeah, I'm going to just start talking about the beginning of the season there, trying to focus my talk on the beginning of the season through the end of grand growth, which is very difficult last year because there was some overlap in where grand period of growth ended and where Vraison started. That said, I'll give you a little bit of background, just on some probably similar data that Rob and Thibaut have been giving you, but maybe a little bit different perspective, but maybe not different perspective. Okay, sorry, I'm getting used to this thing up here. We talked about rainfall. You know about rainfall. I don't need to tell you what happened last year with rainfall. The thing I wanted to stress, though, is it doesn't really matter to me what it does in January and what it does in February, viticulturally at least. I mean, obviously it matters to erosion, it matters to flooding, that matters to filling up reservoirs. But viticulturally, it doesn't really matter. But what really does matter to me each and every year, and this year may be a little different, but most every year, is what happens in March, April, in the springtime. So the rainfall we get in the springtime is the most impactful to me, especially since my focus is highly about water management. And so, you know, we have our soil profiles they'll hold maybe a foot of water or so, plus or minus. So if we're getting, which are typical around here, 24 to 30 something inches of rain, we're always starting out with a full profile. Even this year, we're looking like we have a full profile after the last set of rains we had, but it was getting a little sketchy. So to me, it really matters what we get in the springtime as far as our rainfall, because that does make our lives a little more challenging. Typically, we don't irrigate here in the North Coast. Most of our vineyards aren't irrigated until much later into either late spring or summertime. Some are not irrigated at all. But it's always very difficult to control our water status of the vines if it's raining. And of course, in April last year, it did rain substantial amount. I'm shown here. This is a weather station I believe this is the one in Chalk. It's in Chalk Hill, or at least it's a vineyard off of Chalk Hill Road. So I'm a big follower and believer in soil moisture monitoring, and this is just a chart, I believe, yes, of soil moisture. This is the average soil moisture from 0 to 48 inches where the soil, so I'm not looking at individual levels, but I'm looking at individual years. So I'm going to do a lot of comparisons from year to year just to kind of show you that. It makes it a little easier for me to put a year vintage into context if we have the other vintages adjacent to it to look at. And so this is the total water content, and I hope this works. And if you haven't seen these before, this is relative water content. So the numbers aren't specifically that important, but it's wetter up and it's drier down. And this is over time. And so you could just, I don't know how well the colors are showing up here, but 2017 is in red, and it's this line here. So this is the April rains, and you see it continued to fill up the profile. Essentially at 80, that's roughly field capacity for this particular soil. Yep, okay. And you can see that it obviously was wetter than the other years we've had. And so what's that going to do? Well, the vines are going to grow more. And as Thibaut said, more water availability, higher nitrogen availability is going to cause more growth. And it really wasn't until here, which is about sometime mid-June, where they started to come together as far as the years all kind of converged. But all that time up to June, the vines were pretty happy and pretty fat, happy and growing pretty rapidly. We got here, what I have here, I'll try to bring this up here quickly because I'm going to run out of time. I know this is kind of behaving strangely. Hello. Okay, there we go. This is this is a site in Green Valley, by the way. This other slide, the one before, it's the same site. It's in Green Valley. So it's a vineyard we don't irrigate until August typically, which is what's happening here. And this is the various levels. And you can see at the various points, this is the 8-inch depth. That's about where the water became less available and started, so you can see that inflection point, and that happens here and here. And so it starts shallow. Eventually, the lower depths start running out of moisture. The water becomes more difficult to obtain, and then the vine gets more stressed. Well, the lower profile depths, the 40 and 48 inches, really didn't start to slow down until August. So that water was just there, and this is a Goldridge soil, so it does hold water fairly, not really well. So it's a sandy loam, but it's fairly deep. What I do want to show is the water status of the vines. This is plant water status over time, and this is the same vineyard. And so that blue line here is, I believe, that's leaf water potential, and this orangey line is stomatal conductance. And I drew here the targets that we're looking for, and they actually didn't turn out the same as where I wanted them to be. That was a little lower, and that one's a little higher. But anyway, the idea is that we really didn't hit our targets until August. So that means we didn't irrigate, but we had trouble getting these vines to slow down. And that was pretty much true throughout the county. This is the same. This is the leaf water potential chart. And then this right here is our shoot tip rating. So we look at the shoot tips, and when it's a 5, it's rapidly growing. When it's slowing down, we're talking a 3. And you see that. So you see that the shoot tips did not slow down until August, and so they went right past veraison, which is somewhere. Well, I think I showed it right here, and they kept growing, and that was very difficult to control the vine growth. So what else happened? We had trouble containing our canopies. I gotta find a place to stop here. We had dense canopies. We had trouble getting them done because we had labor problems because of, well, labor is a problem, and just getting around to our canopy management was very difficult. So what happened is we had mildew, a lot of mildew last year, and that's a photo that towards the end of the season of some Chardonnay. I didn't manage that. That's just a picture I took. Trust me. I hear this year in, year out. This is the worst mildew year ever, right? You can't say that every year, right? Well, we've been saying that every year. If you look at this, I only have a couple more slides here on this side of the talk. These red lines, this is the average mildew index. This is the Gubler index, and this is that Chalk Hill vineyard I was telling you about. It's not any higher than any other year. In fact, it's lower. And if you look at this is an average over the month, and this is the maximum over the month. So again, these red lines are not any higher than the recent year. So it wasn't the worst mildew year ever environmentally, but it was a very bad mildew year, and largely partially because it was difficult to control the canopy density. Getting sunlight into the interior of the canopy was very difficult. But also, I think I can't leave this floor without saying I think we're starting to get resistance. We are starting to get resistance to some of our fungicides. Some of the best or least mildew canopies I saw were organic vineyards, who are using sulfur, or sulfur oils, and some of the others who do not have the resistance we're getting with some of the synthetics. I'm not a proponent of anything specifically. I do both, organic and conventional, but I do believe we need to be cognizant of that. I think I'll take a break now and let Tio get.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Sort of coming back to your statement about winter rain doesn't matter. In the drought years of 14, 15, 16, we saw in Lake County on volcanic soils, we saw really early bud break, particularly Cabernet Sauvignon.
Okay.
And our explanation for it was heat capacity of the soils being lower. So, I mean, that's why Riesling pushes sooner in the Rheingau, right? So, and then I'm not sure that our data correlates completely with this, but it did seem like things got sort of back to normal in 17, where we got a later bud break. And so for us, as your slide showed, all that water in March was a catastrophe in terms of set and yield and vine balance and everything else, because we had persistent calyptra, we had lousy seed number, lousy set, and I just wondered you know so much more about all this. What do you think are the factors that affect when the vine decides to get going in the spring, and in particular, why on earth does it affect Cabernet Sauvignon so much more than Cabernet Franc and Merlot?
Oh, you had to add that last one. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Thanks, Clark. I mean, I do agree with you that the dry soil is going to cause earlier bud break, and primarily because of the warmer soil. I do agree with you that water itself has a high water heat capacity, high heat capacity, and so lack of water and more airspace is going to warm up the soil deeper, and that's kind of what was happening this year until we had the more recent rains and the cooler weather. A lot of buds were starting to swell, and they still are. So that definitely is. I don't mean to dismiss the winter rain. It's definitely important. And if you look at other regions, Lake County is a little different than Sonoma, and Paso Robles or in the Central Coast is extremely different. And it's much more arid. And yeah. So I do believe that soil temperature has a lot to do with when bud break occurs, but above ground temperature has a lot to do with it as well. And so does nitrogen status and what have you. I don't know if I can answer the question quantitatively, but qualitatively, a drier soil is going to cause an earlier bud break. And I think a lot of these early bud breaks are causing problems with fruit set. And we're getting into the crappier weather of the spring before the spring has a chance to settle out, and we're getting these problems with fruit set. We've had it for several years. That wasn't a super good answer. I don't know the Cabernet thing. I'll have to think about.
Thank you, Mark. Mark will be back shortly. I wanted to elaborate a little bit on the question. At the beginning, I was going to include some of the latest findings regarding how soil temperature is hastening or slowing down the onset of the phenological stages. I invite you to look at the talk that was given at the Vintage Report in Napa in 2017. It's a video. We invited this professor from Harvard, and what she pointed at, which I find is very interesting, is not as simple as warmer soil temperature, earlier bud break, earlier bloom, earlier set, earlier veraison. Actually, the plant response is non-linear to heat accumulation, which means that you will see earlier and earlier phenology with warmer temperature up to a point. And beyond that threshold, more heat accumulation will actually delay the next phenological stages. and she beautifully explained that, and it's now the standard model that is being used to predict what's going to be the effect of more elevated temperature, not at speeding up phenology, but actually at slowing it down. So there is an optimum, and she explains it much more clearly in this video. So what I would like to do now that we have had Mark's view is what happened during these months of April, and how is that actually interacting with what we understand about plant phenology. So what's very important to remind ourselves is that from bud burst to bloom, and more specifically from bud burst to leaf node development number 8, most of the plant inherent development is not relying upon atmospheric condition, but it's rather relying upon how much reserves are available. And that is the carryover effect from last year. So within that red boxes, we have a lot of things that are actually likely to carry over what happened last year, since early vine development depends upon energy available. And to illustrate that, I thought it might be relevant to look at what happened last year in Bordeaux in response to frost. This is one of the things that we need to be ready for. We should see more erratic extreme events. Maybe I'm completely off topics here talking in California about frost, but in case I am not, in case we have frost event, I thought it would be interesting to share with you what we've observed. And look on your left-hand side, you see a map that shows the combined effect of shoot number multiplied by shoot diameter. We do that by dragging a laser beam behind a tractor, which counts on a per linear meter of vine row how many biomass the plant has been producing. So instead of essentially weighing the shoots and coming up with a pruning wood at some disparate points, we have a continuous measurement of how much biomass has been synthesized the previous year. And you see that before 2017, we had area in this block on the top where we observed more than 500 square millimeter of wood section per square meter of ground. And essentially, most of the block had synthesized over 450 square millimeter of wood. After the frost knocked the leaf area development during stage 2 in 2017, the plant had to reset itself because the leaf area had burnt due to the frost, and ask for an additional storage use in order to boost a second leaf area development within 2017 period 2. The price to pay for that is a decline in the amount of carbohydrates that were stored. And you see when we came back the year after, before bud break, on average, the amount of wood available to sustain the growth in 2018 has been knocked off by 10%. So this illustrates with a simple map how climate is affecting the distribution of wood and what's going to be available to fuel the beginning of grain growth during period 2. I think it's important. Here we had an illustration with frost, but similarly, as Mark was highlighting, a dry winter will also cause a lowering in the amount of nitrogen, which means that it will have a carryover in the next year. Remember 2014, very dry, therefore less nitrogen available, therefore less reserves, and therefore less yield in 2015. So I think it's important to start connecting the dots from one year to the next. Heat wave, similarly, will disrupt the timing of phenology. That's why I was hinting at the work presented by Volkovich at the vintage report. But if you browse through the literature, same results are coming from New Zealand, from Bordeaux, from Portugal. Heat wave will sometimes slow down the speed at which physiological reserves are going to be used. So that leads to my second take-homes. When you try to have corrective actions based on wood production, Well, the simple rule of thumb is that if the footprint of last year has had for a consequence to lower the pruning weight or to lower the wood index, well, you have a set of actions to take for the next year, whether you're lowering the number of nodes left after pruning, whether you remove cover crop or increase fertilization. All of that has to do with how you play with the pool, the initial pool of carbohydrates available before next season kicks in. And similarly, if wood index has increased, you try to mitigate the fertilization. So why is that important? Well, because at the end of period 2, we can define the crop coefficient. And what is the crop coefficient? Well, the crop coefficient is what is defined right before period 3 starts. And what it is? Well, in theory, the crop coefficient describes plant ability to transpire. So what you have to understand is that on a daily basis, the amount of water the plant uses varies. Every day it varies, and it's actually set by the climatic demand. A high climatic demand, provided there is no other sources of limitation, will drive a higher water use for a given plant, and that same plant will transpire less if the climatic demand is lower. So the crop coefficient essentially will drive the amount of daily water use considering the climatic demand, but with that it will also drive the speed at which water in the soil will be depleted, and therefore what's going to be the timing and the severity of water deficit. So it's very important to connect something that happens early, the crop coefficient, with what is going to induce in terms of precocity, severity of deficit. And last, as we will discuss, the crop coefficient is a very early information that tells you what's going to be the yield potential for maximum berry volume. Technically speaking, the vine crop coefficient, since it is a plant-based measurement, is derived from a plant-based index. And this one here is the sap flow. So what we've been doing, we've been computing the maximal amount of water the plant could use. We've divided by the maximum climatic demand. And when the peak transpiration is being reached, we are able to characterize the maximum crop coefficient. So why is that important? Because I know this concept is fairly difficult to grasp at first, but it's still very important for production because the value of the KCB will drive, as I said, the timing and severity of water deficit. And what is a bit counterintuitive, when you see a larger plant, if it has the same amount of plant available, it's actually a call for a higher risk of stress. So plants that have a high crop coefficient, provided the amount of plant water available is the same, are more at risk to meet stress earlier. So sometimes when you look at a weaker plant, it's actually better protected against a water deficit, even if it looks weaker. A higher crop coefficient, provided nitrogen and water are non-limiting, will drive a greater photosynthetic activity, which in theory should drive a greater berry volume and more sugar per berry. So with Mark and with Nicolas' talk, we will see if that theory is actually being met in terms of production parameters, namely looking at berry volume and sugar, maximum sugar amount per berry. But for now, the take-home I want to highlight is that, as Mark was saying, as Rob was saying, here we can actually quantify what has been the footprint of this early season at boosting the crop coefficient. So it's a little bit more than just saying the leaf area is greater. It's actually looking at leaf area intercepting light and efficiently fueling the photosynthetic activity. You see we had roughly an increase of 15% in crop coefficient. That's looking at all the vineyards that have been consistently, years in, years out, being tracked. You see we went from under 40% to almost 50% on average. So the questions I'm asking here is, okay, we see the plumbing of the plant is set up to have larger pipes. Essentially, when you have a greater KCB, you have greater pipes, you have more water being vaporized into the atmosphere. What I'm saying is that, okay, so if by the end of May, by the end of June, we see a greater KCB. Can we already predict that berry volume will be greater in 17 than in 16 and 15? Can we actually use data based upon the anatomy of the berry to corroborate that point? That's what will be discussed with Mark and Nicolas. But keep in mind, I'm going to connect berry volume variation and the total sugar amount per berry with this graph. The take-home is that based upon those conditions, we observe that maximum crop coefficient is reached early and is greater. To give things in perspective, when looking at California at large, stepping up from purely Sonoma, we used to reach that point towards the period after the solstice. So after middle of June and sometimes even in middle of August. Now with more elevated temperature, we reach that same stage 1 month earlier, which means that the moment in time when we are going to start leaking water into the atmosphere is 1 month earlier and is happening when the day length is the greater. So the shift in the phenology of when KCB max is being reached means an earlier onset of water deficit. And this is the physiological reason. When the sun is at its highest position in the sky, we are already at maximum capacity of losing water. And we will see, as I was saying, if, as the theory predicts, those conditions have driven a greater berry volume and a greater amount of sugar per berry. But the other key plant index we need to look at is nitrogen. So we've understood the architecture, we've understood the piping of the plant, but what about the coating of this piping, how much nitrogen is there within that plant system that I am assimilating to a piping system? Well, it's not only important for physiological reasons, it's also very important for winemaker reasons, because with a high nitrogen supply, you know that if you go too much, you should expect a delay in fruit maturation. You should expect a lowering of anthocyanin content. And if you really push it too much, actually too much nitrogen will lower the yield by reducing fruit set. On the other hand of the spectrum, having not enough nitrogen will reduce yield, but then if you look at it from an aromatic perspective, if you are looking at white varietals, actually it could be a negative footprint. Sauvignon Blanc, Riesling, those varietals are actually benefiting from rather a high nitrogen diet to boost their aromatic complexity. But the opposite is true with Merlot, with Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon. Here I am hinting at the work from Alexander Pons and Hilbert. And those guys have clearly demonstrated that for red varietals, less nitrogen is good for aroma complexity. So that makes it quite challenging for a winemaker that is trying to boost its aromatic complexity. Should we lower end supply? Should we higher end supply? It has a lot to do with white versus red varietals, and it has also a lot to do with your winemaking strategy. So how can we be better at understanding nitrogen uptake in the context of temperature changes? Well, we think it's all about timing at the end of the day, and I think that's going to be the focus of precision viticulture. How can we be better at timing things, not necessarily quantifying them, even if it's very important, but when are we reaching key physiological changes? And so what I'm going to discuss with you here is looking non-destructively at how much nitrogen is actually accumulating in the leaves. Can we see patterns? Can we see a moment in time when the peak nitrogen concentration is being reached? And can we, according to this knowledge, refine our management of nutrients inside the plant? So what we are doing here using this device is coming every week on some specific leaves, and by blasting light on the leaves, we are exciting some compounds by the phenomenon of bioluminescence. In exchange, the plant is emitting light from within the leaf and flashing it back out. And by reading the signature of this light, we can actually read how much nitrogen is being accumulated inside the leaf tissue. So if you do that on a weekly basis, this is what you see. At 400 growing degree days, we are roughly at set. At 600-700 growing degree days, we typically observe the peak of nitrogen uptake. And then it declines up until veraison. So this is a very interesting way of looking at nitrogen entering the plant, because we can look at what has been the maximal amount of nitrogen being reached before the plant stops accumulating nitrogen. And importantly, we can look at when this peak of nitrogen uptake has been met. And that's going to drive the timing of the diagnosis for nitrogen deficit or nitrogen excess. And that's also going to drive the timing of when to have a corrective action. Of course, you're going to have more efficiency when you try to apply nitrogen into the plant if you apply it while the plant is actively taking up nitrogen. So what I'm going to center the discussion upon is, what about this timing? Is it always around 700 growing degree days that we reach the peak of nitrogen? And what does it mean for our diagnosis? Well, it's very important from a vineyard management standpoint to know that point in time when the peak nitrogen is being reached, because it's going to tell you when to assess nitrogen needs and when to come up with corrective action. But also from a winemaker and a wine production standpoint, the peak of nitrogen in 2018 will drive the yield potential for 2019. So this year, what you are going to see is actually the carryover effect of last year nitrogen uptake. The second thing, if you are driving your vineyard in order to boost color accumulation, well, you should know that a moderate deficit in nitrogen will boost color for red varietals. And again, I refer to the latest bibliographical work for Hilbert or Souberan that we've discussed in our previous workshop, or that's online. And at the end of the day, how much nitrogen the plant has been able to accumulate will drive photosynthesis efficiency and therefore the smoothness of the sugar flow going from the leaves to the berries during stage 4, while sugar is being loaded into the fruit. So what have we found? Well, we found that there are essentially two kinds of vineyards. There are vineyards that accumulate nitrogen early and fast, and there are vineyards that accumulate nitrogen late and at a slower pace. So if we try to quantify that in terms of numbers, this is what we found for Cabernet Sauvignon in Sonoma. You see that in Sonoma Valley, whether you look at 2016 or 2017, most of the game is over before 800 growing degree days. You see that the peak, so here what you see on the y-axis is the date expressed in heat accumulation when the maximal amount of nitrogen is being met in the leaf. And it's before 800 growing degree days in fast accumulator sites. So with those guys, you need to do your nitrogen assessment before, and you need to have a strategy for corrective actions before 800 growing degree days. And what's interesting is that it's built in. That means that once you've known whether your site is an early or a late accumulator, you know that it's pretty much going to be repeating itself from one year to the next. Give or take some seasonal variations, but you see in 2017 we were slightly earlier, but still it belongs to the pack of the early accumulator, as opposed to the sites that are actually waiting up until after 800 growing degree days and meeting their peak of nitrogen sometimes at veraison or around 1,000 growing degree days, so 1 week, 2 weeks before veraison. And for those guys, the bad trend is to early diagnose deficit, when in fact those sites are simply slow in getting there. So, and they are never in deficit. But if you are actually fooling yourselves because you are doing a diagnosis too early, you're going to try to correct by adding more fertilizer and throwing your vineyard out of balance because you keep feeding it with more nitrogen because you get early signs that there is a deficit. When in fact, those vineyards are actually commanding a later date for your nitrogen assessment. And I think in the context of more elevated temperature with less moisture in the soil due to drought, nitrogen is the second thing that's going to hit us. We are going to get better at monitoring water flow, but we need to be better at understanding the flow of nitrogen, considering limitation in water flow. So I think this is something to be really aware of for the years to come, because yield variations, once we get down the optimum irrigation strategies, are going to come from nitrogen supply variations. So knowing whether you have a late or early nitrogen accumulator is important. I illustrated it with Cabernet, but the same is true with Merlot. You see, we have sites that have to wait until a certain amount of heat has been reached, and sites that are much quicker. So know your site, and this will be my fourth take-home message. In terms of nitrogen uptake, I think we can actually link the two. This is why I spoke about crop coefficient earlier. But years that have an earlier maximum crop coefficient should be achieving earlier a peak nitrogen. And something that's also very interesting is that when we have a lot of biomass that has been accumulated, as indicated by a higher maximum crop coefficient, if the same amount of nitrogen has been available at the root system, well, this amount will be diluted into more biomass, which results into the false perception that there is a nitrogen deficit, but it's not because there is less initial nitrogen in the pool of the root reservoir. There is simply more biomass to be diluting this nitrogen into. So it's always important to assess your nitrogen needs or your any nutrient needs in terms of how much biomass are you diluting these nutrients into. The practical take-home from those readings is that we need in the future to keep the vine, at least if you are growing phenolics, you need to make sure you're not pushing too much nitrogen into your plant by not assessing too early your need for nitrogen. So essentially the take-home is make your assessment whether nitrogen is needed when the peak of nitrogen uptake is being reached, somewhere during period 3. So that you do your nitrogen assessment at the highest nitrogen concentration. And bear in mind that if you have earlier a higher crop coefficient, well, it's okay if you see a small decline in nitrogen concentration. It's simply a dilution effect. It's not because you are suffering from not enough nitrogen. So if your plant appears to be giant, and if your nitrogen is lower, well, it's expected. So with that in mind, I'd like to invite Mark and Nicolas to discuss how this stage setting during period 1, 2, and 3 is actually affecting the berry ripening patterns. And so we're going to look at stage 4, how much sugar and how much volume gain is being observed, and stage 5 with the two next speakers. But before I do that, I'd like to characterize a little bit the context within which those ripening patterns are going to be discussed. Again, I've been looking at the warmest and the coldest sites. In terms of temperature, the winner was Dry Creek, with temperature on average during stage 3, so the stage during which deficit can be positive or negative onto production. And you see that in 2017, on average, during those 30 days, we were at 42 Celsius, which is around 108 Fahrenheit on average, if you look at the maximum temperature. We've never seen that over the last 4 years. And then I've looked at a heat spell in terms of vapor pressure deficit. Why am I doing that? Well, remember, KCB, if you talk in terms of plumbing vocabulary, tells you the size of the pipes through which water are going to vaporize. But what's going to drive the flow of water out is the amount of water deficit in the air, which is what vapor pressure deficit accounts for. Vapor pressure deficit actually tells you how dry and how warm is the air outside. And therefore, what's going to be the pool of water, draw, how quickly your wet clothes are going to basically dry out, is expressed by the notion of vapor pressure deficit. And a high vapor pressure deficit, 6, 7, 8 kilopascal, means that the draw of water by the deficit of moisture in the air will be extreme. So if you combine large pipe with an extreme draw of water vapor, well, you have a recipe for earlier water deficit and cavitation, because sometimes if the draw is too quick and if the size of the piping is too wide, you will simply induce cavitation, the water column will break, and you will have air bubble inside your vascular tissue. High crop coefficient combined with high VPD, that's a recipe for cavitation, and later on it might be a recipe for fruit sugar accumulation stop. On the good side, in Sonoma being so complex, you see that even in a warm year like 2017, Carneros here win the prize, but we also had, I think, Bennett Valley, Green Valley amongst the pack of very low accumulation of heat spell. You see we were actually below 4.5 kilopascal, so very normal. That already says that we should see very smooth ripening kinetics in colder area and very disordered ripening kinetics in areas that were beat by a high crop coefficient combined with high KCBs. So the practical questions I'd like to ask is there going to be a carryover effect between heat spell during period 3 and the maturation kinetics during period 4 and 5? What are going to be the carryover effects in terms of plumbing machinery, cavitation risk? Can the brutal atmospheric water deficit reduce berry size even if everything is set to have large berry size? What's going to be the impact on sugar flow rate? Our next two speakers hopefully are going to shed some light on it. So Mark, thank you for accepting to slice your presentation in two parts.
All right. So I don't know. I think to answer my opinion on the early the grand growth and the you'd expect, yes, a big canopy to be prone to water stress. I didn't see a lot of that yet last year. We had the problem almost universally that we had trouble getting the moisture out of the ground. I think so. We didn't really see water stress occur. In some cases, yes, but most cases it was later than we ideally wanted it. Which ideally we want to get our water stress dialed in before Veraison, a couple, 2 or 3 weeks before that. Some cases we did, but a lot, especially with the drier soils or the more rocky, coarse soils. So yes, we had heat last year, and that's what I'm going to talk about and the effects of the heat. So I'm going to kind of review this really quickly because Thibaut and Rob already went through this. I just wanted to show heat summations, which 2017 is not there, but sometimes things get messed up in translation, I guess, between the programs. But 2017 is the right one, the one, the red. It was definitely warmer in obviously in some months than others, but overall, what you're not seeing there is 2017 had about, I think, 3,050 degree days at this particular vineyard. This is a Chalk Hill site. So it wasn't that much different than the previous years. Obviously, much warmer than 16, but not that much different than 15. But what really made it different wasn't the overall heat. It was the events, and these were already pointed out again by Rob exactly. And the arrows got shifted apparently, but you remember all the heat events that Rob talked about, and the one that in particular that was really telling and that probably defined the whole vintage was the one over on the Labor Day heat event. And again, though, to reiterate what Thibaut said, VPD was very important this year than other years. And of course, the VPD climbed extremely high on all those days of the heat. Much more than in previous years, as you can see all the noise below it, but the ones that poke out are all 2017. back in June, back in August, and the big one in September. The weird thing is, and this isn't shown here in my slides, we've been finding some some higher humidities in our measurements. When we're taking our barometer measurements, we also note humidity. And humidities in general, day in, day out, have been higher, and we've had to change actually the configuration of our barometers to accommodate the higher humidities, which is strange. But at the same time, these events seem to be extremely dry. So, my thoughts were on the early season events, the heat events in June, and in early July, the pre-brazen heat events. I didn't see that much immediate detrimental effects. In fact, I think it might have induced a little bit of stress that we weren't getting with the water, because we do want some stress. We want to elevate some ABA and abscisic acid in the vine to stimulate some of the ripening machinery, some of the ripening enzymes in the fruit prior to veraison. And I think that may have had a little bit of a stimulating effect. I'm pleasantly surprised to hear about a lot of winemakers saying that their wines are actually turned out pretty well, and maybe this has something to do with it. Maybe it didn't. But I didn't see any immediate problems. I didn't see any canopy leaf burn. I didn't see any fruit damage by the early heat events. The post-veraison heat events were definitely detrimental, and we've seen that. You know that. I don't need to tell you that, but I think it's important to look at some of these and maybe what we could have done to mitigate those negative consequences. So this is a different weather station. I did this when I was too lazy to do this again with the the data set I had from Chalk Hill. So I used this. I had this already set up. This is an article I wrote for, an article I wrote for Wine Business Monthly that I put this chart in. The September 1st, this is the diurnal, so this is by time, and this is air temperature. And so you can see September 1st, the blue one is actually August 22nd, I think it was. It's not showing up in the legend. But that's what I call a nice warm day. You got about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. But on September 1st, it got up to about 112 or 113. But what really was important, I think, was not just the heat, but was the VPD. And that's what this is. This is diurnal VPD, so vapor pressure deficit over time. Again, this is eastern Napa. So it's different, a little different than Sonoma, but it's still the same idea. You can see the difference between August 22nd, that blue line, and September 1st, just a week or two later, a couple weeks later. The difference in VPD, not just temperature. Now, how important that is, I think it's very important, because let's look at estimated berry transpiration. So berries transpire, they don't have any stomata, active stomata after a couple of weeks, so they are pretty much dependent on the environment, on how their water balance is maintained or not maintained. In this case, not very well. So I got this, I estimated this from an equation from, it's not showing up, from Keller, a paper from, I can't remember the Zhang and Keller, I believe, but I can't remember the actual name. It was on here to help me, but I can't see it now. They came out with a relationship between VPD and berry transpiration. So really nice to have that. And I used that same equation, or derived the same equation from their chart to get this. And this is just an illustration. Again, August 22nd is the blue line. September 1st is the orange line. And this is the VPD over time, the diurnal vapor, the transpiration over time, in milligrams per berry per hour. And obviously there's a huge difference between the 2 days, a warm day, a very warm day, and an extremely hot day. If you look at that, if you sum up or essentially take the integral underneath that curve, the area underneath those curves, you get the amount of water transpired per day. Again, this is estimated. The dry day, the very extreme day, was 168 grams. That's a lot. Seems really high. Whereas the other one was 38 on the less hot day, 38 grams. Now that water is replaced through the phloem, primarily. The water is replaced within the plant through the phloem. Can Can the vine supply 138 grams of water? That's still astounding amount of water, if that's even right, or 168 grams throughout the day. I doubt it. And so what we see is berry shrivel. There's a lot of discussion on how could we have reduced the berry shrivel. So as I mentioned, the berries are fed by the phloem after veraison, not by the xylem. There is some xylem backflow that can occur, especially when it's really dry, and that probably did occur in this case. But transpiration is the primary water loss component of the berry at this point in time. So irrigation may have mitigated the shrivel, but really I think it's more a matter of exposure. So fruit that's exposed is going to experience that VPD in all its glory. Ones that are less exposed, like on the backs of the clusters, or with some leaf cover, had much less shrivel. And so I do believe that irrigation had a component, that some vineyards that were irrigated prior to the heat wave, maybe perhaps even in excess, had less of the shrivel, but they still got shriveled. I think personally I need to be less worried about a little extra irrigation at this point in the ripening period. We have a tendency just to really minimize the amount of water we put on. And I think there's a couple of situations where I probably could have mitigated this a little better personally than I did last year. But on the other hand, I think it was really a matter of exposure. And I think that's something we have to rethink as far as how much exposure we have our fruit in the canopy. And so we have to think about row orientation when we plant a vineyard. That's super important. Is the fruit shaded at 3 and 4 in the afternoon when it's the hottest and driest, or is it in broad sunlight? The VSP canopy, I think Rob mentioned, didn't do very well. Should we be planting everything in VSP? Or leaf pulling, I didn't write down here, but leaf pulling, stripping the canopy bare, even on one side, may not be the way we want to go. We started doing some tunneling, doing the interior leaves instead of the exterior leaves. That's very expensive because it's hard to train somebody to do that, and you can't use a machine to pull interior leaves, at least not yet. I'd love to see that. But I think those kind of canopies, that kind of canopy management fared a lot better. This is some pictures I took middle of September after the heat wave of a vineyard that fared very well. And I know some of you might recognize this one, at least one person in the audience will. It's a divided canopy, and if you just notice that picture doesn't show up very well, but there's a nice amount of shade on the fruit while the fruit is actually fairly well exposed. Otherwise, you can see all the clusters. You just have to duck a little bit underneath the umbrella of canopy. We had very little shrivel in that block. I mean, we didn't change the irrigation regime at all in that particular vineyard. The other things that can happen, it's not just the fruit, it's also the leaves. And I believe that had a lot to do with what happened late in the season, is the heat can damage the leaves. And we had some scorching, but I didn't see a lot of scorch this year. I think a lot of it was more subtle than that. There was a lot of damage, though. The photosynthesis in the leaves were clearly affected. And here's another place where I think water management could have helped. So a little bit extra water may have not saved the fruit, but it may have saved the leaves in many cases, because the leaves would be able to cool themselves better. So photosynthesis is affected. As I mentioned, there's two photosynthesis. I didn't mention, but there are two photosystems you've probably studied before. I read that photosystem 1 is heat stable, much higher than photosystem 2, which is sensitive to over 105 degrees, and these leaves clearly experienced over 105 degrees. In these cases, the enzymes are denatured in the leaves, and it's not always reversible. In this case, I think a lot of leaves were damaged beyond repair. I think this was expressed more in leaves in vines that had red blotch, and I think if vines that had red blotch were really impacted because you had you really had two things on top of each other. Berries themselves can be affected negatively. You can denature the enzymes in berries. I had the feeling that, except for the ones that were obviously shriveled, that it may be more of an issue with the leaf scorching and with leaf damage than the berry damage. But I think there was definitely some berry damage. So berries are damaged, like over 100 degrees, they start exhibiting heat shock proteins. Over 105 degrees, they start denaturing proteins as well. And so that can be very damaging. I got a couple of quick slides here. I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but I asked a friend of mine or a colleague or a client actually to give me some curves of their bricks. I don't know these vineyards. These are the appellation and the variety. So we have Green Valley, we have Russian River, we have Dry Creek, we have Alexander Valley, and then we have Pinot Noir, Zinfandel, Syrah, I think is not in here, Petit Syrah, and Malbec, and Cabernet Sauvignon, and Grenache are all in here. But some of them, they behave differently, okay? If you look at the two Pinot Noir graphs, this is that red one here, you see it did, the heat occurred around here, you see it did flatten out, stopped accumulating sugar, or it stopped, the bricks stopped increasing. And the same thing kind of happened out here with this other Russian River Pinot Noir vineyard. But some of the vineyards did continue to increase in bricks. The thing is that's not that clear here is that, and I know the next talk is going to be on sugar loading, which is going to be much more interesting than this. I like to look at this. I like to look at this is titrated. Don't get too much. This is all kind of messed up, but I don't want you to study these. But I'm looking at where the titratable acidity stops, and I'm looking at where the pH stops. And this is my final slide. Okay. This is all the vineyards. This is when the TA stopped dropping. This is where when the pH stopped increasing. And this is when it was approximately harvested. I don't know when they were exactly harvested. I'm basing this on the sampling. Some of these were harvested well after what I call it metabolic stop, when the acidity stops declining. That's when I consider the berry to stop metabolizing. Some of these were harvested well after that, meaning I think that was harvested based on shrivel. So I think the bricks accumulated based on shrivel in these particular cases. Some of them stopped fairly close to when the metabolic pathway, and that happens to be, I believe, this is a Zinfandel. We're not harvested far away from when the metabolic berry metabolism stopped. Yeah. Oh, okay. This is AVA, this is variety, this is bricks per week. This is the bricks per week, and you see that some of them were fairly high and some of them were fairly low. And so there's a big difference across the county on how this all performed. This is when the TA decline ceased. This is when the pH rise ceased. So this is kind of the criteria I'm using to show when the berry metabolism stopped. And this is the approximate date of harvest, and this is the spelled wrong metabolic stop. The days after it was harvested after the metabolic stop. Sorry, it shows better on here. Anyway, that's pretty much it. I don't have a lot of time. I don't have any time. I think we could learn from our fruit exposure. I think we could learn from a little bit by irrigating a little bit extra, which hurts me to say, but I think we can. I don't think it's going to be as detrimental. I think we still want to get our water stress dialed in prior to veraison, not after. It's less important then, and I think we need to protect our fruit. And that's pretty much all I have to say. Thank you so much.
So there will be time for questions before the second morning session starts. So thank you very much, Mark. I think this gives a very interesting practical look. The next presentation will aim at actually taking one step back and look at how those observations illustrated by Mark are actually fitting the bigger picture when we look at hundreds, more than 600 sites. So I wish the next talk would have been given by Niklas, because he's the expert. He's been doing that for more than 15 years worldwide. I was hoping that Cecilia, who works for Nicolas, was going to be giving the talk for me. So Cecilia, I know you're here. Yeah, so thank you. Unfortunately, Cecilia had a tooth surgery, so it's a bit more difficult, but she can talk with you if you have questions. She might be better able than I am for some to answer, since I am talking on behalf of Nicolas. So the concept of berry active sugar loading, to me, is very interesting, because it's a way to further decipher ripening kinetics. What does it consist of? It simply consists of switching from monitoring bricks, which is concentration, and instead monitoring the total amount of sugar that the berry can hold so against its gradient, because what you have to understand is that there is only so much sugar that can be held and maintained within a cell, provided you have to fight against the osmotic pressure that a lot of sugar within a contained environment is exerting, asking for more water to come. So from there, I'm hinting at the fact that there is a physiological threshold to the maximum amount of sugar a berry can take. And how can we characterize the trajectory up until that point is being reached is precisely what the concept of sugar loading is trying to uncover. So if you plot on the y-axis days in, days out, how much sugar in terms of grams per berry is being accumulated, so you remove fluctuations in the concentration that might be caused to berry water losses that have nothing to do with active loading of sugar, you see actually a S-shaped curve. There is a starting point when the berry shifts from being a vegetative organ, as Mark was saying, with functional stomates, up until a sink. It becomes a reproductive organs. The stomates are being frozen in an open position. And essentially, as Mark was showing, there is a lot of water that can be lost because the stomates are no longer functional. During that stage, you can actually characterize how long the berry is actually calling for sugar. You can also say, just like Mark was showing with the date of pH or TA, you can just say when is the date when the plateau of sugar is being reached. And from there, you can also characterize those two together by looking at the slope, the speed at which sugar is loading. You can then characterize another parameter, is how much sugar was being reached at the time sugar loading stopped. And you can then look back at, okay, considering how much volume I had when the peak sugar was reached, what was the Brix, what was the concentration? So with those 5 parameters, we can now really increase the granularity when we go about comparing different maturation kinetics. So you see, we have 5 parameters here that can be characteristics of each maturation kinetics. I think today I'm going to really focus on the parameters number 2, which is the rate of loading during the first phase, so during this really brutal sugar loading. You see that for Cabernet Sauvignon, on a daily basis, less sugar is entering the berry compared to Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And this is probably something structural that is the footprint of the genetic makeup of the plants. So some plants are programmed to have a lot of sugar fast, and some plants are programmed to limit a little bit the speed at which sugar is loading. So what does it mean for Sonoma? Well, what I'm going to present here is a statistical analysis of more than 800 analyses of Cabernet Sauvignon that we've been plotting over the course of the season. And what's very interesting is to see that we can really see this trend appearing of a rapid sugar loading that plateaus around 200, 210 milligrams per berry. And that is actually how 2017 can be characterized. So you can characterize what I refer to the maximum sugar amount, S-max. And you see that in 2017, it was 205 milligrams per berry. It's a lot. You will see in a minute that it's more than in the past. And that's when I have the light bulb in my brain. Oh, that's funny. That's also higher crop coefficient in 2017. But until I demonstrate that, let's also look at when this maximum sugar was reached. Well, it's exactly when Mark was showing the peak of the heat wave, as if the heat wave could knock off this phase of sugar loading. So that's actually the profiles I wanted to compare. You see that 2017, just like was announced by the plant architectural parameter, is characterized by a higher maximal amount of sugar. I think that's very interesting because maybe, and this is purely speculative at this stage, but maybe we can connect plant inherent ability to set up its crop coefficient by the end of June with plant inherent ability to accumulate sugar by the end of August. And you see that the math is working fairly well. If you remember, the crop coefficient was gradually going up from 14 to 15 and then increasing almost 20% between 16 and 17. You see a similar trend in maximum sugar. And I am speculating that maybe the plant is announcing the ripening kinetics, but hopefully in the future I will be proven wrong or right according to the data. But if we try to put numbers into that scheme, well, if we look at the maximum amount of sugar, you see very clearly that we have a 20% increase in statistical trend in terms of maximal sugar amount per berry, 205 in 17 versus 170 in 15, and versus 155 in 15. If we look at the speed at which sugar has been loading, so you have different interpretation. When I was talking with Nicolas about how to comment in lieu of him, I asked, why do we have, in your opinion, a faster sugar loading rate in 2017? 5.3 milligram per berry per day instead of 3 or less than 3. For him, it's because we started accumulating sugar later. Yes, it's possible, and actually you see, if you look at the duration of sugar loading, that it was 31 days instead of 36. And that's a completely valid hypothesis. I'd like to suggest that maybe another reason why we have a rapid sugar loading is also because we had a greater crop coefficient and maybe simply larger vascular tissue leading to more sugar into the fruit. I don't know which hypothesis is the most relevant. They may be all relevant. I find it's interesting to relate the speed of sugar loading with the inherent plant ability at converting light into sugar, which is what KCB is telling us essentially. Another interesting point is that in spite of having a shorter period of active sugar loading, we reach a greater Brix, meaning that maybe the speed at which sugar was loading outpaced the speed at which berry volume was increasing. So even if both berry volume and sugar loading happened at the same time, proportionally, sugar is loading faster than the berry volume is growing, which is not always the case, as you can see in 16 and 15. So here I'm hinting at the fact that there was a very rapid accumulation of sugar, and that may also explain why we have this lack of ripeness, phenolic ripeness, even for high Brix, as our keynote speaker has highlighted and as Mark has also hinted at. So you see, we can say a lot by simply looking at those sugar loading profile. So essentially, the take-home for Cabernet Sauvignon, shorter period of sugar loading, a faster speed of sugar accumulation, and the result is more sugar per berry. So now, let's look at berry volume. Since it drives the yield, it's also an important parameter to look at. Classically, it's a bell-shaped curve, particularly in arid climates like Californian or Mediterranean climate. It peaks and then it declines. So if you look at the second section of this graph, the one that stretches from September 2 up until October 8, what it is interesting to do is looking at how fast we observe a decline. So we can actually quantify the berry volume loss that is being observed. And in 17, we had the most spectacular drop in berry volume that has been recorded over the last 3 years. And again, that is very coherent with what Mark was saying about the pressure exerted by those late season heat spell. And that is also very well aligned with the fact I was saying earlier, greater crop coefficients, are more at risk of late season water deficit. And this data seems to corroborate with a different method that at the berry volume level, it's a similar phenomenon. Actually, you see that over the last 2 years, we were losing berry volume. Sure, that's expected, but twice less. And we had also lower crop coefficient. So you see how I am trying to connect the dot here between the plant and the fruit through Nicolas' presentation. So this is the second take-home. If we purely focus on berry volume, we were set to have bigger berries, as the crop coefficient was suggesting, but the heat wave actually was a bigger toll on the berry volume loss, since we lost 22% instead of 11%. So I'm going to fly through the next 3 slides, but I invite you to speak with Cecilia. But essentially, there is a nice follow-up with the monitoring of sugar loading, because you can use the sugar loading end as a reference point to time the window of your harvest depending upon how many days after cessation of sugar loading you decide to harvest. The concept that has been confirmed by Nicolas and Cecilia is that the more you wait until after sugar loading stops, the more the aromatic profile is evolving from a fresh fruit aromas towards a ripened fruit aromas. That on the aroma level, but if you look at the mouthfeel and tannin, which hopefully will be the discussion that we will trigger with Tori during the second part, you have also an impact of the harvest date positioning with respect to the physiological stages of ripening the berry is at, with the idea, again, that the closer you are to sugar loading cessation, the greater will be tannin reactivity, so therefore the perception of astringency, and the lower will be the perception of sweetness. And the later you are, the lower is the perception of astringency, and the higher is the perception of sweetness. So that was for Cabernet Sauvignon. Now for Pinot Noir, what is the picture? Well, the picture we have is, again, a tendency to have this rapid sugar loading curve reaching, as we expect, like it is with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, a higher level compared to Cabernet Sauvignon. You see, 25% more of sugar has been incorporated into the berries at the time the berry stops calling for sugar. And the stops, fortunately in the case of Pinot Noir, happened before the heat waves, which probably sets the ripening kinetics of Pinot Noir in a very different realm compared to the Cabernet Sauvignon, because they were early varietals, early ripening varietals. And you see, they just stopped accumulating before the heat wave. So, essentially, you see that it means that compared to the previous years, we don't see such a huge gap between the last 2 years. So, the sugar loading occurred naturally and stopped around 250, which is not so different from the previous 2 years. Or actually, the last column is the average of the last 5 years. So the take-home is we were on par with previous vintages. The duration of sugar loading was not reduced. So again, it's very important to distinguish how to read those sugar loading profiles according to the specifics of the varietal. So you see 2 very different pictures depending upon Pinot Noir or Cabernet Sauvignon. So the conclusion for the Pinot Noir is that we had, unlike Cabernet Sauvignon, a classical pattern of sugar loading. In terms of volume, well, again, it's not as bad as what we've seen with Cabernet Sauvignon. We lost berry volume, but only 13%, which is more, but not so much more as it was with Cabernet Sauvignon if you look at the average in California or how Sonoma was over the last 2 years. So the conclusion for berry volume, the game was set to have larger berries. Well, it's not a surprise since the crop coefficient was already set to be bigger. And we also observed a berry volume that was there, but relatively on par with what's expected. In the interest of time, I'm going to fly through the last slides that try to connect the positioning of harvest window with the sugar loading ends, but I invite you to speak with Cecilia if you want to have more info. So before we break the session, I would like to leave the room with this question. Okay, we've understood how sugar was loading. We understood how the plant architectural parameters were setting up the stage for fast or slow ripening kinetics. But what does that mean for phenolics? What is the link between sugar accumulation and color accumulation? Are those two happening in sync, or are they actually decoupled? And what does it mean from a winemaker standpoint? Should we still position our harvest date based upon early information coming from the sugar loading, or should we less and less rely upon sugar loading in order to actually focus on phenolic maturation? Are we going to grow grapes based on phenolics, or are we going to grow grapes based on yield? Those are the questions that hopefully we're going to discuss during the second session. But for now, I think it's time for the coffee break. Thank you for your attention, and we'll reconvene in approximately half an hour. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we officially start again, we wanted to use this wiggle room in between to potentially address some questions that might have arose during your talks. I had a very interesting set of questions by Clark Smith about the contribution of seed number to actually drive berry volume. I was wondering if some of you had also observed similar correlations between number of seeds and what it drives in terms of maturation kinetics. If, so that could be one set of questions. The other set of questions that Clark was bringing forward is, I didn't mean to oversimplify the consequences of nitrogen management onto aroma complexity. I was referring to papers that showed that when you have with Sauvignon Blanc higher nitrogen supply, sometimes it translates into a greater complexity or a greater quantity of thiols. Same thing with a few terpenes. But what's important to put back in context is that the way you manipulate your nitrogen supply in the field has a lot to do with the type of wine objectives you're trying to have. So that was what Clark was bringing up. Are there any questions that you would like to bring forward before we resume the talks? Because if there are none, I guess. Yes?
You talked about the low rate and high rate vineyards
Yes.
in accumulating nitrogen. Do you have any characterizations of rootstock, soil type, dry farm versus irrigated?
Yeah, so actually, the reason why I was not even hinting at the set of parameters that program your vineyard to be a late versus an early accumulator is because I don't know. It seems to be a very complex mix of rootstock and scion genetic makeup, but also site-specific heat accumulation and site-specific soil temperature and site-specific vapor pressure deficit all together seems to drive for a faster or slower nitrogen accumulation curve. So for me, I'd love to come revisit that question in a few years down the road when we can connect what characterizes an early accumulator site with the set of pedologic, genetic, and environmental parameters that really define the context within which we observe those early accumulation. The thing that I can say is that typically sites that accumulate heat slower tends to also accumulate nitrogen slower. That's a very raw generalization. But then there is also what is the architecture of the plant. Plants that seems to reach their maximum leaf area early also seem to reach their peak nitrogen early. Also, it's not always the case. And the third thing that we've observed is that when you come from a plant that is losing pruning weight years in, years out, you tend to peak in nitrogen earlier and earlier. So when you manage a vineyard to produce high yield, for instance, and where you try to maintain a high biomass, a high wood index, and if you are slightly overcropping the plant, you see the wood index is declining, and you see that the peak of nitrogen is being reached earlier and earlier. So a little bit as if the vineyard was telling you, you start to asking me too much, and I am not able to replenish my reserves. And so that translates with maps of wood index that years in, years out, a little bit like what I was showing, the frost affecting a drop in wood index. That's what you see. You see your vineyard going gradually from green to yellow to red in terms of wood biomass accumulation.
But does it seem to be an inherent characteristic of the vineyard that you can predict?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's an inherent characteristic of the vineyard, whether it's a late or early accumulator. So once you've defined the timing, then you can look within that expected time frame whether you are earlier or later than the last year. But remember, some of those vineyards, they peak at 400 growing degree days at bloom. That's bloom. Whether others are way after pea size. So if you try to assess at bloom a pea size peaking block, you're always going to say you're in deficit, and this block will always be on the side of the overly vegetative, overly vigorous expression. You're basically feeding your junkie with more nitrogen. Yes?
How does nitrogen uptake impact the vine before bloom? More specifically, is vigorous vine more susceptible to shatter?
Yes. So the relationship between shatter and high nitrogen vine was demonstrated, I think, in 96 by Carmen Vasconcelos. So there is a lot of old literature body that, yes, showed that a relationship between excess nitrogen uptake and greater shatter degree. But now the question is, how much is excess? And so that's how we try to revisit this early work from Vasconcelos by understanding, okay, are you talking about accumulating nitrogen too early and too high, or are you talking about the final peak value of nitrogen being too high and then triggering shatter? And you understand why I'm saying that, because if you are on the rise while accumulating nitrogen at the time of set, then you won't have an issue with high nitrogen, because at the time the set was occurring, the nitrogen was still actively flowing into the plant. But if you are in an early accumulator site where the peak of nitrogen is really high already at bloom, well, then you can look at a negative effect of excess nitrogen uptake at causing shattering. But this is kind of new, you know, the timing of nitrogen peaking, varying between 400 or 900 growing degree days. This is fairly new. Actually, a very good work was published by Schreiner in 2016. It's in the ACV, I think. And he did a very good job at reviewing the state of the art in terms of timing of not only nitrogens, but all nutrient uptake. I use actually his work to define my timeline. It's a good paper, Schreiner 2016. He did that on Pinot Noir. And he looked at 2 consecutive years, and he sliced period 1, period 2, period 3, and not only looking at the leaves, but the root biomass, the trunk, the shoots, where are the potassium levels, where are the nitrogen levels, and I think that could give some more food for thoughts and augment your question. But this is something we are discovering with you as well. You know, the timing of nutrient uptake is site-specific. It's, wow, a big thing. Yes? Oh, sorry, the mic.
So you do multiple tissue analysis during, and how often?
Yes, so in the case of nitrogen uptake, it's a very difficult question, actually. If you are interested in exploring fluorescence, the work on fluorescence started in 2005. And what drives the amount of light that's being re-emitted once chlorophyll has been excited is the amount of flavonols and the amount of chlorophyll within the plant tissue. So what we are doing is actually normalizing our reading by contextualizing the nitrogen reading according to leaf thickness and the effect that leaf exposure to sunlight will have on boosting the synthesis of flavonols. And when we do that, we can actually have the freedom of picking leaf number 8, 9, or 10, and systematically assessing leaf 8, 9, or 10 from bloom to veraison. So it's important to take into consideration leaf age, and it's also important to remove the effect that sunlight is having at increasing leaf thickness, number 1, and leaf flavonol content, number 2. And once you correct for those parameters, then you can compare different sites, and you can compare different varietals that grows at different elevations with different light regimes. That's how we do. Does that answer your question?
How often?
Every day, if you can. We do it every week, but you could do it every day. Honestly, once a week, you can actually see the trend. But typically, vineyard growers that sees on a Tuesday that it is low does a foliar spray on Wednesday, will come back on Thursday to see, or on a Friday to see what has been the effect of the plant at taking up the foliar spray. And then that will be twice a week for 2 weeks, for instance, to track how quickly the plant is accumulating. But as a baseline, I will do it once a week.
And you were saying leaf 8, 9, and 10 because that corrects for the factors you're talking about?
It's no, the correction is done within the system. Leaf 8, 9, and 10 is just because that's when the leaf are, like it's when you are a teenager as a leaf. You are in good shape, you synthesize. The basal leaves are starting to senesce already by the time you reach 900 growing degree days. And the younger leaves are, Mark was hinting at photosystem 1 and 2. So those two photosystems peak in their efficiency at different time. You want to make sure when you measure those leaves, they are fit. So that's the consideration. It's more leaf age versus photosynthetic efficiency. Yes?
What's the name of the tool you use to measure the nitrogen?
It's called Dualex. Okay, so there are no more questions. And I wanted to basically regroup a little bit everyone's mindset. What are the main take-home from the first morning session? Well, during period 1, 2, and 3, we reach higher crop coefficient. Mark showed it. We saw it. The level of water deficit, even if it could have been more severe because we were consuming more water, was actually lower, which is also in very good argument with the fact that we observe a higher berry volume, and which is also a good reason to interpret why we saw a greater berry volume loss in some situations. The second point, larger berry volume, faster sugar accumulation rate. Well, we ended up with more sugar per berry at the end of sugar loading, as Nicolas in its presentation was hinting at. So that's for the early stage. But then the stage of the fruit ripening, now period 4 and 5 are really shifting the focus on fruit anatomy and fruit composition. Higher sugar berry higher content and higher bricks at the end of sugar loading was the norm. But the heat wave had two contradicting effects. On early maturing varietals like Pinot Noir, it could affect berry volume loss, but not so much, and it did not appear to disrupt berry sugar accumulation. We were around 250 milligrams, like the average. However, for late maturing varietals, the combination of having a greater susceptibility to late season stress due to a greater crop coefficient set up the stage for a greater risk of berry water loss, which we saw actually corresponded to a 22% on average of berry volume loss. What I'm going to share with you is that heat can also delay color accumulation. That was the introduction I wanted to make before inviting Tori Arvik on the floor. But I thought it was very important because as the climatic models are predicting, it's very likely that the frequency of high temperature will keep going up. So we need to understand what it means and how long it takes between the timing you have a heat exposure and the timing you see the negative consequences on berry kinetics. So first of all, I would like to share some data that we have obtained in practical conditions by doing exactly the same thing we do with fluorescence, but instead of blasting light onto the leaves, we are blasting light onto the berries. And by doing that, we can actually coming every week and track here on the y-axis, what you're seeing is how much color is being accumulated within the berry skin. And you see, so you can do that destructively, but with this approach, since it's a non-destructive approach, you just blast light, excite the cluster re-emits light, and the proportion of lights that's being re-emitted is a function of how much total anthocyanin is actually blocking the light from being re-emitted out. And then you can convert that in terms of milligrams of anthocyanin per square centimeters of berry skin, which is what we have plotted on the y-axis. So it's a way to accompany the timing of when to really assess the berry polyphenolics content. Typically, if you wanted to couple this data with when to make an HPLC analysis, you know how to interpret the trend of your HPLC, whether you are in a flat area or in an accumulative period of your total anthocyanin. But here, wait a minute, there is something that's not normal, because total anthocyanin is expected to be a smooth curve that goes up, flattens, plateau, and keeps its total color accumulation if heat does not degrade anthocyanin. And if heat degrade anthocyanin, Mark said it's around 105 Fahrenheit. If you look at the work of the Japanese were actually doing the first work in 2007, they saw that at 35 degrees Celsius, which is a little bit less than 100 Fahrenheit, you start losing exponentially color. So the sweet spot is around 35 Celsius. And every time you expose your berry temperature to temperature levels that are beyond 35 Celsius, you're losing color. But that's not what we are seeing here. Here you're seeing a berry that starts accumulating in orange early August. You see in blue a site that starts accumulating a little bit later. And then they are stopped in their accumulation. They flatten in a period during which they are supposed to accumulate. And then by the end of September, they start reaccumulating color. So this is a very odd pattern, because it's not at all the bell shape or the S-curve that we were expecting to see. And to not make any mysteries about it, it's just the heat affecting a cessation of color accumulation. So during the first part, we talked about sugar and primary metabolites and acids. Now we want to speak about secondary metabolites. And you see that they have a much greater footprint, revealing the effect of heat. And what I'm going to try to convey here is that because of color responding even more exquisitely to heat, the gap between peak sugar and peak color is going to get wider and wider in the context of warmer temperature. And it's not only me saying that. The Australians have published on that in 2011, but now we see it with data obtained in the field. But in order to put that in a broader context, I'd like to share one paper that was published again last year, and they specifically looked at increased temperature 2 weeks before veraison. What does it mean 6 weeks after veraison? So essentially, they were trying to characterize the effect of leaf pulling early season in order to favor light penetration into the cluster zone, for all the good effects that light can have on aromas, for instance. But at the same time, the payback for exposing early the cluster to light may be worse, because actually you increase temperature early at the berry level. So in that experiment, the team has actually set up a material and method that increased by 8 degrees Celsius the berry temperature by simply removing laterals. So here we are talking of something very touchy, because what the vineyard manager does in June is potentially susceptible to affect the composition of your harvest in September or in October. So that was already a known fact, but they were trying to quantify it. So essentially, those are the two graphs that are here, and then the paper goes on to explaining what it means in terms of genes. But if you look at the bottom graph, you see the green window shows you the length and duration of the heat period. 8 degrees Celsius above average temperature, it is what we have observed in 2017 at the beginning of July. Okay? And you see in red that 3 weeks later, the sugar accumulation started to happen when we exposed the fruit to heat. Whereas when the fruit is not exposed, sugar accumulation happens right after. So high exposure to high temperature has a 3 weeks delay into converting the fruit from being a reproductive organ to from being a vegetative organ to becoming a reproductive organ. So that affects, on the bottom graph, the sugar. On the top graph, you see they have tracked the percentage of coloration in berries. And you see again, there is this lag between the exposure to heat and then 2 weeks later, coloration happening. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a delay of at least 2 weeks in terms of exposure to high temperature and its carryover effect in terms of initiating maturation. And it affects differently sugar and color. So this is my fifth take-home message, because I think in the context of warming temperature, we should know that when you apply during period 3, so pre-veraison, treatment affecting the cluster temperature, you're going to decrease color content at veraison. It's a proven fact, and now we are actually trying to understand mechanically what are the mechanisms behind it. In practice, high temperature is the most likely culprit for the delayed accumulation of phenolics in the fruit. From a vineyard manager perspective, watch out. The positive benefits, the benefits of having earlier light penetration may be offset by the negative downside of having a delay in phenolics advancement. And from a winemaker standpoint, this is also a call for asking yourself questions about cap management. Because if you induce earlier more color degradation, and if you lower the color potential, you need to factor in the latest work from Bindon in Australia. She's like the press or the pop of tannin extraction, and she's shown a few months ago that color in the wine matrix increases tannin extraction. So here I'm not monitoring color for the sake of color. I'm monitoring color for its chemical footprint in the wine matrix. If you have more color, the diffusion of tannin will also be enhanced. So when you're monitoring color, you're also monitoring a lot of other things. And so if you have less color, how does that affect your cap management? How does that affect your extended maceration time? How does that affect your harvest decision? So that's why I'm saying that color is important not only for color, because also the rate at which color accumulates has been put into relationship with the wine color density. And I don't know how to explain that yet, but you can look, Google Sadras in 2007, you will see that paper. And Sadras is another big name in the world of tannins and color. And he showed that when color accumulates faster, even if you reach the same total amount of color at harvest, you end up with an easier extraction of stable color in your wine, whether it's right after pressing or 10 months after bottling. So it's a puzzling result, but it seems that the way color accumulates is a strong predictor of how stable is the color going to be in your final wine. That's why actually what happens in August can be related with the way you're gonna manage your cap immediately after harvest. Another very important paper I don't have time to discuss, but I think it's something that's worth brainstorming upon, is that more wine color extraction will mean more tannin extraction, and vice versa. So it's very complex, but essentially it's important to know that cell walls, pectins, cell vacuoles, but also color are all drivers of the ease with which tannins are going to leak into the wine matrix. And if you want more information, on our vintage report website, there is going to be a video of Federico Casassa, who elaborate a little bit deeper what I am talking about. And this being said, I don't want to make shortcuts. It's important to know that monitoring total anthocyanin is only part of the picture. It's not because you have more color in your skin that you end up with more color in your wine. You need to factor in the ease with which color also is going to be extracted, and it's dependent upon the mechanical resistance of the skin, or many, many things. So just have a grain of salt in not jumping too quickly to overly simple conclusions. More color is good because it's gonna probably drive more tannins, and if it fits your production objectives, that might be a desirable outcome. It might not be as important if you're growing for yield. But bear in mind that at the end of the day, you will still hit the challenge of how does cell vacuole, cell walls, and tannin interact with them. And the last thing I want to highlight is this fact. I'm trying to, here in orange, having the duration of the period 4. So you see, on average, in 2016, we had longer duration of sugar accumulation. In 17, it's a shorter duration. But what we have observed is that the peak of color is actually reached later in 2017 rather than 2016, which is exactly on a larger scale and statistical analysis basis what the researchers have shown under controlled conditions. Heat decouples the timing of sugar peaking versus the timing of color peaking. So that means that for a winemaker, it's going to be more puzzling because in the past, it used to be that sugar and color were accumulating roughly in sync. But since color is more exquisitely sensitive to heat, there is going to be a decoupling between the speed at which color accumulates, which will be later, and the speed at which sugar accumulates, which will be earlier. So that means that you should observe a decoupling between Brix being high too early and the phenolics not being ripe. It's part of the plant response to heat. And I'm saying that based on our data, and I'm saying that based on the scientific results. And the Italians are publishing on it, the French are publishing on it, the Portuguese, the Chilean, UC Davis is publishing on it. So I think it's something to have on the forefront of our mind. And it's my last take-home. I'd like to put forward that you may have the best vineyard management possible. At the end of the day, it's the amount of heat during this color accumulation period that may collapse everything. So it's important to really get a better understanding of the relationship between high temperature and whether or not they are causing a hard stop in sugar accumulation and even worse in color accumulation. You already know that there is a cumulative effect of high temperature pre-veraison that's going to impact the ripening kinetics post-veraison, and that should, at the end of the day, justify the harvest date to be delayed compared to what you used to do in the past. So in order to give a different perspective on those considerations linking sugar versus polyphenolics, we wanted to have an outside-the-box perspective, and this is why we invited Tori Arvik, because not only Tori is very expert in understanding the world of polyphenols, but I think it's important to understand how to really characterize those different families of polyphenols, the rate at which they accumulate, how they recombine, are they combining according to strong bonds, weak bonds, how does that affect the stability of wine sensorial properties. So with that background in mind, it's my pleasure to invite Tori and share with us his knowledge about wine-based flavonoids. Tori.
Good morning. My name's Tori. I'm less of an expert on grape phenolics than most of you in the room, but my current job in the food industry has made me catch up quite a bit. What I'll be presenting today is really more about extending the harvest that you already do. So I'm not specifically speaking to wine grape harvest for winemaking. I'm talking more about what happens to the pomace. So this is a really terrible picture, but this is an example of how terribly we treat the grapes that leave our wineries. And this is where I pick up. This is where I pick up the story. This is a seed separation operation, and basically there's a rotary screen and an auger and a skip loader, and it's an affront to the pomace people like myself out there. We're I work for a company called Sonoma and Whole Vine Products, and basically what we do is we look for that higher, better use of the compounds that are found naturally in the grape skins and seeds and pulp. The reason I have this picture up here is it highlights some of the efforts or some of the processes you go through to improve the quality of the envisioned end product, which is wine. This is Green Drop at Verizon, and it's really all about improving quality rather than getting the quantity, higher volume of grapes through the door. What this does is it concentrates the phenolics, it concentrates all of the aromatics and that sort of thing, and it leads to a better end product that's a higher value add when you bring the grapes in more concentrated. This is basically the group of compounds we're interested in. Anthocyanins, cyanidin, malvidin, petunidin. This is a vial of about 20 nanograms of pure malvidin 3-glucoside that we recovered from some Merlot skins. And we made a few hundred of these vials thinking that we could send them to researchers. So if you know of any researchers who are interested in following on with Binden's work, using little microvinification trials, we have pure malvidin 3-glucoside. I'm happy to send her a few of these. The other groups, flavanothiols, flavanols, stilbenoids, such as resveratrol, much belabored name, and tannins are found in various portions of the grape. And Kennedy had this really nice illustration that he ripped off from somebody that shows where the anthocyanins are, the procyanidins, the proanthocyanidins, et cetera. And what Binden goes on also to show in her paper is that the higher the concentration of pulp material in your fermentation, the more selective the pool of phenolics, selectively the pool of phenolics is changed. So if you have a higher pulp concentration, the more seed tannin will be pulled out of the pool of overall phenolics in that fermentation. I'm not a winemaker, I'm not a wine grower, but to me that would be significant if I didn't have these harsh seed tannins put in there into my wine. Of the flavonoids, we have epicatechin, gallocatechin. These are the sort of basic, simple forms of catechin. You see that they have different hydroxyl groups on one of the rings there, and those make them reactive, more reactive with iron or enzymes further down the track in organisms, for example, like humans. Quercetin is very interesting because it has this vicinal dihydroxy group right here, which makes it very reactive. And so it's less bioavailable to humans, whereas, and it's a flavonol as opposed to a flavanol. But it's reactive nonetheless in very different ways, and this impacts the bioavailability. When I mean bioavailability, I mean for people or organisms to uptake this as a nutrient, because there are people out there in the cocoa industry, or actually in the medicine industry, who view cocoflavanols, the negative isomer of epicatechin, as a vitamin and crucial to life, to human life, as part of your diet. This is an example again of the gallocatechin. Miracetin. It's very highly bioavailable and has a pretty long half-life in your blood at micromolar concentrations. And you would say, well, that doesn't seem like it's going to do very much in a micromolar concentration. But when you consider the complexity of the human diet, everything plays a role. And this is considered an antioxidant, although it's probably just preventing inflammation through the reduction of oxidative complexes. So camphorol, this one's very interesting because you find it a lot in white wines, and it's actually been implicated in increasing bone density specifically in women. There was a paper that talked about camphorol in white wine a glass of white wine a day actually improved bone density in a study of 17,000 women over 2 years. An interesting coincidence, but it makes me want to drink white wine. It also reduces inflammatory response, which could be correlated to these other diseases that we see, or decreases in health, what we would consider healthy. Another very interesting one, which you would think is too big to be bioavailable or useful, is procyanidin C1, but it has been directly correlated to vascular health and easing the tension in the vasculature through a nitric oxide induced mechanism. So we make nitric oxide, we make hydrogen peroxide. It's all related to inflammation and other aspects of our very complex beings and metabolism. This epicatechin, as you can see, also has this vicinal dihydroxy, but in a trimer, it's more protected, and it gets to places like the gut, the human gut, where we have microorganisms that break it down and make it more absorbable. So it's somewhat protected in this form and gets farther into the system. So what do flavonoids do? What do grape flavonoids do? They fill dietary gaps. So if I only eat at McDonald's and Starbucks for the rest of my life, I will have dietary gaps. I will be missing those things that I find in my baby lettuce and my microgreens and my carrots and grape and my wine. And what's true around the world is more advanced societies have wider gaps in their nutrition and thus their health, like metabolic syndrome, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And so dietary polyphenols fill those gaps, and it may be due to an antioxidant activity or increased nitric oxide production or just decreased inflammation. The gross picture is we're left with fiber that is full of trace minerals and these polyphenols, which we know are very good for us. It's just that since World War II, we've decided that we need to process these things out of the food stream because they're bitter or they make it less controllable when it comes to a manufacturing process. So having polyphenols in your diet is a good thing, but sometimes technology gets in the way. This is just a very simple example of some breads that were made by Gary Howe up at the Wheat Marketing Institute up in Portland. And he used our Chardonnay pumice powder to see if he could extend shelf life in a Wonder Bread, basically, example. And he did. He got 3 more days of shelf life, which is invaluable if you're the Wonder Bread people, because that's 3 more days you didn't have to make product to put on the shelf. It has anti-staling properties because it prevents syneresis from water, syneresis from the inside to the outside of the loaf. It keeps moisture where it should stay, or where it was originally, which also means if you're a baker, you're selling more water, which is actually a dirty secret of the bakery industry, but good if you're a bakery. It actually lowered the pH and increased the TA and acted as a yeast enhancer, a food for the yeast, fertilizer for the yeast. So it could strengthen the process there. Again, back to other opportunities, natural red food color. There are companies that make concentrates. You can add the concentrates at fermentation, perhaps, to stabilize or to induce more tannin extraction into your wine. The great thing about grape skin as a natural, or anthocyanins as a natural food colorant, is at low pH, there are very few choices for a very deep concentrated red at low concentration. And that's exactly what you have in a wine. It's red after 100 years. It still pours red out of a bottle. And it's, you won't see that in yam or cabbage or beet. So lots of different applications for these same polyphenols that you're farming. I represent the beginning of a sub-market, if you will. And I'm hoping that instead of putting this stuff on the ground in the future, we can continue the harvest and turn it into more value-added products. So that's my out-of-the-box discussion of phenolics, the continuation of your harvest. Thank you. We have a few minutes. A few minutes if anybody has a, yes, sir. How did that bread taste? The what? The difference in the bread. It was interesting. We had a consumer panel of 60 people, and they liked it between 2% and 4%. It added more character to the bread. It wasn't just white bread. Over 6%, it started to feel, they said it started to taste healthy. But at 6%, you could see it looks more like a pumpernickel or a dark, unmilled, unrefined wheat bread. And bakeries want to control for that kind of impression. Any other questions? Thank you for your time.
Okay, so I thought this outside the box was an interesting way to look at the structural and chemical features that tannins or flavonoids in general can have, and why not taking consideration about color stability from other industries when we are making wine in order to make ourselves even more open-minded to some new solutions for cap management or barrel aging. So to wrap up before inviting more practitioners on stage, what did we come up to today in terms of conclusion? Well, in the future, first of all, I think it's quite established that just like we use bloom, just like we use set and veraison in order to pace the different stages at which maturity unfolds, the end of sugar loading is, to me, another reference stage that's going to be more and more important to monitor, considering the effect of heat on the timing of ripening. So if we want to be a little bit better at having a good discrimination between earlier and earlier ripening profile amongst different years or amongst different blocks, we need to have more time markers of the chemical maturation pace. And end of sugar loading is one of those new index that we can use. Skin color concentration, as Tori also said, affects tannin extraction, just like the ratio between skin and pulp will also drive the type of tannins that can be extracted. So this is something also new because it makes us rethink the simple assumption according to which smaller berry size will lead to denser wines or more tannin wines. Actually, it's a little bit more complex since the ratio between berry volume and berry skin is affecting the selectivity of what's going to be extracted. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And if higher temperature becomes the norm, whether it's before veraison or after veraison or during sugar loading, we should anyway expect more puzzling harvest window to position. We should expect a greater decoupling between technological maturity, that is the sugar loading or the acidity, and the phenolic maturity. So the questions in terms of management will be, are we trying to grow grape for maximum berry volume, for yield? In which case, it will be very relevant to monitor tightly technological maturity and sugar loading and harvest as soon as we hit the peak berry volume, not caring so much about phenolics. Or if we are on the opposite, expecting to grow for phenolics, we should know that there will be a decline in berry volume and that there is going to be a greater time gap between sugar loading cessation and color peaking. In terms of management strategy, well, if we decide to grow for yield ripeness or phenolic ripeness, we will change the timing of irrigation, we will change the timing of fertilization, and we will also change the timing of where to position harvest window. Therefore, the need to be better in the context of precision viticulture at articulating with one another different plant indices in order to get that better ability to improve the timing of decisions. And in terms of winemaking strategy, well, in the future, how are we going to adapt harvest window as we are growing vineyards at higher elevation in hope to get lower high temperature and maybe higher nighttime temperature? How does all of those decisions affect the maturation kinetics and the positioning of the harvest window? And then once you have stick to a given plan, say you always harvest 10 days after shoot berries are stopped accumulating sugar and because you know you are at peak color. How is that going to drive the wine profile and the maceration? Because if you pick a fruit that barely finished its color accumulation, obviously the ease with which the cell walls have been denatured, have been destructured, will drive for an easier or a more difficult tannin extraction and color extraction, meaning in concrete terms, most of the good stuff will be probably extracted earlier rather than later. So it should change the benefits you expected to get from extended maceration in the context of more elevated temperature. So those are all questions that hopefully we will get insights from with our panelists. But before our panelist came on stage, I wanted to invite Byron Kosugi to give his practitioner's take on this season. We've been having this relatively high-level discussion, but how can we keep it grounded and make sure that it does translate in terms of practical decisions? Like, it's nice to have those scientific validation of our assumption, but how do we use that in order to make better decisions? Hopefully, Byron and the panelists will be able to help us. So, Byron, thank you for being here today, and we welcome you.
Hello? I have some notes that I need to refer to, so if I don't make eye contact with you, don't be offended. So before I get started, I just wanted to thank Mark and Thibaut and the rest of the Fruition team for having me here. I've been following Fruition Sciences since pretty much the beginning, although not with the sap flow, just as following the climate information. It's super interesting. I have to admit, though, that it's a little bit intimidating coming up here after all these smart people just spoke. Even though I've been following them for a long time, I find myself sometimes struggling to keep up. I am a Pinot Noir and Chardonnay winemaker, so my experience with the harvest of 2017 in Sonoma County, I also work in other places, was a bit different than some of the Cabernet people in the room. I was glad to see that at some point during the morning's proceedings that it was pointed out that the Pinot Noir, or the early variety experience, was quite different than the later variety experience. And my experience with the 2017 season certainly was not as dire as Rob's. Let me just, I'm not used to doing this PowerPoint thing, so hopefully I won't get too in the weeds with this. There we go. So my observations with the season are pretty much mirror what everybody else has said. A wet winter, high early season vigor, which I actually was sort of happy to see after all these years of drought. There was the mildew thing, which is obviously not a good thing. I did have some concern that the large canopies might be difficult to support later on. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Then it got really hot, as we saw in June and July, which might not have been a bad thing. August was quite mild, and for early variety guys like me, like Pinot and Chardonnay guys, it was a godsend. We were all a little bit afraid of what might happen if it didn't cool off. And then, of course, the Labor Day heat wave. After seeing some of what was presented today and thinking a bit more when I was just sitting over there listening, it did feel like to me that the Labor Day heat wave turned it into two different harvests. And a lot of the Pinot and Chardonnay harvests came before the Labor Day weekend. So I think a lot of what I have to say might seem kind of contradictory to some of the stuff that was presented today. But anyway, that's, I'm not making it up. It was true. So there's a picture of some happy vines. I think anybody that spent time in the vineyard this year saw a lot of this. as I mentioned before, I wasn't totally unhappy to see this happen. It was kind of a refreshing change from dealing with water and nutrient stress, which had been the case in the years of the drought. Plus, we're fairly good, I think, at dealing with high vigor situations. If you've got excess water, it's a little bit easier to combat vigor than to not have any water at all and have the vines need more. And this picture was from kind of early June, right before it got hot. And then it did get hot for quite a while. And one comment about the heat, and this was alluded to a little bit earlier, the heat spells seem to me to be different in distribution than they were most years. For example, there was a graphic that said that Carneros was one of the cooler or the least impacted of the Sonoma County area growing regions, and that certainly followed my experience this year, but that's usually not the case. Carneros, I think, is generally thought of as a warmer growing region than the Russian River or certainly the Sonoma coast. But in general, it was hot everywhere. And this picture, taken from a somewhat stressed site in the Sonoma coast, you would think that the heat was probably kind of a good thing. The canopies were in good shape. You can see the canes are browning off nicely. This is a Pinot Noir vineyard that was probably right around the end of Verizon. I was a little bit worried that because it went through Verizon during the heat, that there might be some unevenness, possible problems related to that, but it wasn't visual, it wasn't apparent visually. And I think I certainly felt pretty good about where the vines are at after the heat, going into those critical weeks leading up until harvest. Let's go to the next slide. As I mentioned, August was mild, and it was mild pretty much for the entire month. That was good for Pinot guys. I did have some, as I might have alluded to earlier, had some concern about the large canopies, and there's a lot of talk about that this morning's presentations. And it kind of took me back to the 2002 season, which was not nearly as hot as 2017. But I did see examples, mostly in Pinot, and in more than one place, both Carneros and the Sonoma coast, of vineyards that seemed to be either stressing or shutting down early. And even though it was a small crop, at least with the vineyards that I was working with in 2002, the wine quality was a little bit disappointing. Of course, and in mid-August, we didn't know if it was going to get hot again during August. And even though a Labor Day heat wave is pretty much the norm around the North Coast, and to some extent we planned for it, we didn't know, or I didn't know, if it might get hot before then. Now the season was tracking, early-ish. There was a lot of stuff that I work with in the Sonoma coast that was getting close to, or that I was anticipating picking around the end of August, and that turned out to be true. And as I was evaluating the vineyard samples going kind of in the middle of August, things were looking good. Sugar was accumulating fairly slowly. Acids were good. Certainly the condition of the fruit was really good, and I was feeling fairly optimistic about the prospects for 2017. I started picking in earnest. We picked a little bit of stuff for rosé, kind of on the early side, but I started picking grapes for Pinot and Chardonnay around August the 26th, so about a week before it got really hot. And the early returns were quite good. I would say that there was some hint both in some of the vineyard samples and in just sort of evaluating stuff when it was on the skins in the fermenters, red with Pinot, that the tannins may not be as optimally ripe as they could have been, but nothing that was really too alarming. And so we picked most of the Sonoma Coast and Chardonnay Pinot that I work with by August 31st, which, as you know, was when all hell broke loose with the heat wave. When I went back to taste through all the wines and review my tasting notes, When I compared them to the dates that they were harvested, that kind of two different harvestings thing became pretty apparent to me. And the wines really kind of grouped themselves into two, but maybe 2.5 groups. Everything that came in before the heat wave, which was mostly Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, mostly Sonoma Coast and Carneros, was quite good. I would say that there was no evidence of decoupling of sugar and color. The fruit was in really good condition. And with now that I go back and taste the wines after they've been in the cellar for a few months, they're quite promising. Maybe not quite as concentrated as the 2015 and 2016 wines, but generally good. The part of the harvest that I think was the most perplexing for me was the time right after the heat wave, and then kind of going maybe a week after that. So say around September the 3rd to the 10th or something like that. There were some vineyards that I worked with that were kind of close to being ready to pick, say around, I don't know, 20 bricks or something like that, but were kind of needed another week to 10 days. Other vineyards that were a little bit further away, maybe they were, I didn't have to think about them so much that were, I was planning on picking them later in September. But the impact in that week right after the heat wave was really kind of counterintuitive to me. Stuff that was pretty much ready to pick right before the heat that for a variety of reasons we let sit, came through the heat surprisingly well, even to the extent that it didn't have much dehydration or raisiny flavors or super high bricks. And the flavors were good, color was good, and the quality was almost as good as if we had picked it before the heat. And you would think, well, fruit that was almost ready to pick was probably at its most vulnerable stage, prone to being shriveled up and things like that, but that was not the case. Fruit that was maybe around 20 bricks and was not quite ready, but would have been ready around the end of this period, say around the 10th, was actually what suffered the most. What you might think would be a little bit less prone to shriveling up because berries were a little bit firmer. But it kind of had that classic high sugar, not quite there flavor, not quite as concentrated as you might hope. Perhaps, and there was some information presented earlier that suggested that it takes two weeks after a heat event to recover, and this is not quite exactly the same situation, but maybe I should have just waited longer. But those vineyards were starting to look kind of sad, so I ended up pulling the trigger. Now, those wines, these kind of troubled wines that came in at high sugar, but maybe compromised in ripening, have improved some in the cellar. They're, I would say the color is not as good, and as we are seeing a few times this morning, color is a good or can be a good proxy for quality. The flavors are not damaged that much. There's not really much in the way of raisiny flavors or dehydration, or kind of dehydration-related flavors. But there wasn't a whole lot of true ripening going on in that week, that I kind of waited before I picked them. But when we get to the later ripening vineyards, and there was a lot of non-Pinot Pinot Noir picked in this period, and just a few kind of late ripening Pinot vineyards. This is when the decoupling of sugar and color was the most evident to me. In almost every case, I ended up needing to wait a bit longer, maybe than I felt comfortable before picking. And again, the wines kind of fell into two camps, and I haven't totally sorted out exactly why it played out in this way. But in some cases, two cases, notably one Pinot Noir and one Cabernet vineyard that I work with, waiting for flavor ripeness kind of took me into the realm of shriveling and dehydration with kind of the expected compromises there. But in most cases, what compromised the fruit or the quality of the wine wasn't so much heat damage or dehydration or raisiny flavors. It was more kind of lack of concentration and sort of optimally right flavors. And in some cases, I waited a really long time. And that's sort of, I mean, that sounds very much like what Thibaut was talking about with this decoupling of sugar and color or sugar and secondary metabolites. And I don't know that, I mean, waiting forever, they may never have gotten there. And also, actually, just say it as an aside, the sort of the 8 million pound gorilla in the room, which was the fires. Luckily, I didn't have to deal with that. All the fruit, I'm an early variety guy, so I know Eric is going to talk about that a little bit later, but I don't have much to say about the fires, at least not this year. I did back in 2008. A couple of somewhat random comments. A lot of people talk about wanting to model your extractions on differences in how the fruit ripens and, the sort of all the stuff that we've already talked about. The way I make all those decisions is kind of, well, I wouldn't say on the fly, but it's very much kind of in response to the fruit as it comes in. And so I was thinking a little bit about this last night, and I didn't really notice doing things differently in response to the fairly extreme kind of differences in the wine composition that we had this year, other than the approach to the picking decisions, which I've already described. I think that, and I don't do much Cabernet, and I didn't do a lot of extended maceration, so I can't really speak to that. I would say, kind of as a final comment on the wines in general, when I look at them on the whole, that the stuff that came in before Labor Day, as I said before, was quite good, and maybe not quite as good as 2016, but good, and it's still early. And then everything, especially the later stuff that came after that, kind of that critical 1 week period, right after the worst of the heat, that's much more of a mixed bag and in more predictable ways. I haven't said much about white wine. I do make a fair bit of Chardonnay. That didn't seem to be very affected at all, surprisingly, other than a little bit of a brick spike in the stuff that came in right around the heat wave, and even during the heat wave, we actually picked a little bit of Chardonnay during the heat. We pick at night, so it was, at least the fruit came in cold. And the flavors are good. And even with the whites that came in kind of towards the end of harvest, mid-late September, I didn't find the problems, and these were not so much Chardonnay, but Rhone whites, Marsanne, Roussanne, and Viognier. I didn't find any sort of difficulties with getting good ripe flavors and having reasonably balanced chemistry and that sort of thing. So I don't know if this echoes what other people's experiences were. I know Rob didn't have much fun with his Chardonnay, and the whites that I've just referred to were not, in some cases they were not even from Sonoma County, but they were from pretty warm areas. So I'll throw that out to the room to you guys to talk about. So I sense that my time is up. Do I have that right? Pardon me? Yeah. So what I was going to say is, are there any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Did you water those vineyards before the heat spike? Later?
In most cases, they're not vineyards that I own, but in most cases, we tried to be pretty proactive with irrigation prior to the heat. We knew it was coming, but not everybody was as willing to put water.
So it's Pinot Noir, so you're watering it that late date. You think that play out in the concentration that you're seeing. You're watering a couple of days before harvest.
Yeah, I have not found that to be the case, and when I've advocated it, maybe we're not putting on enough to dilute the flavors, and certainly watering right before the heat, if you're going to pick in a few days, it's not particularly effective anyway. But it seems to me that the trade-off between coaxing the vines through a heat wave is probably worth potentially a little bit of dilution. Other questions? Yes?
I'm sitting here wondering about, when you say that you had less color, I'm wondering whether you looked at the bleachable pigment.
I did not. This is strictly observations on what I saw coming into the winery.
Yeah, it's the same question I have about the other talk. It seems like the terms anthocyanin and color are being used interchangeably, and they're completely different. So it may be, and I see this with a lot of Pinot producers, that they think they don't have much color, but in fact what they have is monomer color, which is only visible at maybe 20% at normal wine pHs. And so if you just put a little acid in it, you may find that you have a whole lot more color than you think.
The somewhat maybe less than intuitive thing about the color question with the wines that I made this year is, with only a couple of exceptions, Pinot was not the one that suffered from a lack of color. It were some of the other varieties that I worked with, some Rhone varieties and things like that, which was a surprise. I mean, I was expecting there to be more, at least potential problem with color, but it so far, I mean, this could change. The wines haven't been in barrel that long, but so far it seems to be okay. Anybody else? Yes? Production? Reduction. No. It seemed, at least in my cellar, which is not, certainly isn't comprehensive for the entirety of Sonoma County, it seemed like there was less reduction than average, if you will, and pretty cooperative fermentations. All my stuck wines are from someplace outside of Sonoma County. Anything else? Thank you very much.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you, Byron. So that was nice because we had a Pinot Noir winemakers. Now I'd like to invite people who are dealing with not only Pinot Noir but also other varietals. So Ned, Jen, and Christina, if you wouldn't mind to join us, that would be very nice. And now the goal is to maybe start a discussion while I'm asking a few questions to our three panelists, and then hopefully we can break the session with question and answer with all of you. So thank you for being here. So I'm going to... Do we have another mic? No? Okay, so there is one mic to be shared. I'm going to let you introduce yourselves in 2 minutes, and then I will have a few general questions to get started. So, Jen, if you don't mind starting.
Oh, I get to start. How fun. My name is Jen Higgins. I'm the winemaker at Lambert Bridge Winery, which is up in Dry Creek Valley outside of Healdsburg. And we are a small winery. We do about 7,000 cases, but we make about 15 different wines because we sell to our membership, and that's how we sell all of our wines. So that means that we are getting fruit from all over Sonoma County, from Rockpile all the way down to Moon Mountain District, and working with a variety of growers. We have about 45 acres that we own, and I help manage. And so it was a tough year. So that's all I have to say for now. But
I'm Christina Scheidler. I'm the winemaker for Arrowwood Winery. We primarily do Cabernet Sauvignon, so about 90% Cabernet Sauvignon from 3 different AVAs, Sonoma Valley, Knights Valley, and Alexander Valley, and also bring in a couple other varieties, Viognier, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, even some Rhone stuff. So very small exposure to some other varieties.
Okay, well, my name's Ned Horton. I'm vineyard manager at Guerrero Vineyards, also in Dry Creek Valley. I oversee production on 3 estate vineyards totaling just over 90 acres, all certified CCOF organic. We farm with biodynamic practices, and our vineyards are planted with an emphasis on Sauvignon Blanc, Zinfandel, and Rhone varietals. Okay.
So I have maybe
Now you need it back.
just to make sure we get the conversation started, but hopefully it can become less formal. Regarding the early season stages, are there any consideration you had in order to manage differently your canopy, your water, and maybe your nutrient during the year compared to other years? Do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that's important for us is in a year where there's, with the season definitely kicked off with high vigor, is making sure that to keep the fruit healthy and keep the canopies healthy, that we have good spray contact. So we were pretty aggressive early on about suckering, and I think in the end that might have been one of the things that helped us because we were early on getting good sun penetration into the green tissues. One of the things, we've been talking a lot about heat spikes here, and one of the things that we didn't see a lot of was real damage to green tissues. So that was the beginning, and then obviously we got our cover crops down pretty quickly, and as the season progressed, we kind of shifted gears as the weather changed.
Okay. Now, Jen, do you want to add anything?
Should I share this?
You can share.
I was actually quite pleased with our canopy management at the beginning of the season. Yes, we had vigorous canopies, but by prioritizing blocks, we also do some organic farming. So by prioritizing those blocks, getting laterals removed earlier, getting some good sun exposure into the canopy, I was really happy about how things were looking. The more vigorous vineyards, we did delay suckering a bit to kind of let them exhaust all their energy and go back in maybe a couple times to modify those canopies. One thing that I thought was unique to this year, early season, was I saw a lot of shoulders on Cabernet, which usually is not the case in at least my vineyards. So we did quite a bit of shoulder removal, but going in up until June, July, I was actually pretty happy with how we had managed our canopies early season.
And then I would say also for us, we have a few ranches, particularly up on Moon Mountain, that canopy management is everything. And so what we've done, where we usually would pull laterals everywhere, we've kind of modified that because we wanted to shelter the fruit a little bit more from intense sun. So that happened. Wings also, but we always remove our wings. But yeah, it was a year that you really had to play to the vineyard, I think.
Okay, so the other question I wanted to ask you is, considering the complexity of Sonoma, the way different appellations within Sonoma are contrasted because of the slopes, because of the exposure to marine entries, do you see in the context of warmer temperature more or less contrast between sub-regions in Napa? In other words, is it more complex for you to manage the fact that Carneros or Sonoma Coast are maybe proportionally less affected by heat than the Kings Valley, Alexander Valley? Is this putting the extremes more apart or more tight together?
You want to start? You want me to? I'll start. I love this. We found that I think the contrast is a lot more widespread in Sonoma County for sure. We found a lot more variability between our ranches. We had a lot more cluster collapse happening on our cooler ranches in Russian River and also in the Fountain Grove area, Reebley Road area, than we did up in the warmer climates. So that was kind of interesting, and I don't know if that was because we also were leaving the canopy on a little bit later, pull some of the moisture out of the ground, and maybe it was opened up a little too late, and maybe that it wasn't acclimated enough. But I think it's very, very diverse.
What about you? You manage so many different regions.
Well, actually, no. That's the thing. We're really pretty narrowly focused on Dry Creek Valley. Okay. So the variability that we see within blocks and subblocks, and they tend to be based on soil type and rootstock combinations. And I would say that the polarities are becoming more extreme within blocks.
More extreme within blocks.
Well, within from one, yeah, like I'm saying, within those different combinations.
Okay.
On thinners, for example, 101-14 on a thin soil versus 110R on a valley floor.
Sure.
you know, this past vintage, in the latter scenario, we had some good outcomes. In the former, not so much.
Okay. I don't know if you want to say.
Yeah, I would say that I saw quite a bit of variability between AVAs, but also within the vineyard, especially early season. Vineyards that were in the past more homogeneous, finding areas that were more vigorous, less vigorous. If I had to compare the 3 AVAs that I work with in context to Cabernet, I would say that perhaps the influence of Carneros and kind of that cool air Carneros into the Sonoma Valley, my vineyards fared better in Sonoma Valley than somewhere like Alexander Valley, where I did see those desiccated clusters and a little bit more shrivel up there. Knights Valley was probably the most sheltered, but with that, that fruit had to hang around a little bit more and put us into mid to late October, which also wasn't a good thing this year.
So it seems when I hear you that in the future we need to gear our effort towards more site-specific management practices, where in the past it was easier maybe to put everything in the same bag, so to speak. And that's a trend we see worldwide. Like more and more people are doing block-specific weather management. The timing is also getting more and more block-specific. So in that context, it seems important to standardize the way we analyze the season. I wanted to ask you what other alternative methods outside the ones I have suggested, 5 different periods, one leading to the next. What other ways of slicing the season seem relevant to you, or what comments could you bring to criticize or improve that way of analyzing the season? I'm thinking plant calendar based on the moon, biodynamic calendars, days calendars, growing degree days model. Like, how do you see those different models contradicting each other or actually leading to the adoption of one more standard timetable? So whomever wants to answer.
Well, yeah, I'll take it. I'll start with that one. I think all those models are really important to get a deeper understanding of vine physiology in the different stages. For us, I think the one, the kind of dominant factor is veraison and making sure that we're prepared for veraison. That looking for high wine quality, we want to make sure that the canopies are set up and the crop is balanced going into that. So again, I think the 5 stages you described are really important because there's effects of 2 that will impact 3 and so on. So, but we kind of start from there and then move out, I suppose. Obviously we don't want to get aggressive about leafing around bloom. So I tend to think more around, how are the different physiological stages evolving each vintage? What is the crop coefficient? How much horsepower do the vines have? And that's going to impact not only how we manage the canopies, but then also cover crops and cultivation, and then irrigation. So I think our perspective references all those, but tends to be very, very vine-specific and block-specific.
Okay. Christina or Jen, do you want to elaborate? What I'm thinking, for instance, I know some winemakers are actually setting up their projected harvest date based on number of days post-bloom, for instance. In the context of temperature changes, is this going to be still relevant? Like, I'm trying to have you respond to those other time scales.
In the past, I've paid attention to the growing degree days, but I find that it's becoming less and less relevant, especially in years like this where you think you're on track for something and there's this complete stalling period. It was very irrelevant this year.
Yeah,
for me.
that's what we saw too. I mean, it's nice to have that idea, but not anymore. I mean, it just doesn't, you can't follow it anymore. And that stalling of the sugars and the acids and the flavors was so evident this year for us because we picked most of our fruit after the heat spell and before the fires. It's kind of in that zone there. So, yeah, we had to just be patient. It wasn't a year that you could rush into anything. You had to be watching.
So what would you do in order to track the footprint of the season?
I thought you were going to tell us what to do.
I mean, I suggested this framework with 5 stages, but maybe there is a better one or
No,
more nuanced.
I mean, for me, it's really spending the time out there. It's more intuitive. You're walking, you're tasting, and you're looking for that something that you need to have.
So I had another questions. So, yes, more in terms of winemaking. Well, Jen, if you, how did you adjust your extraction techniques in 17 compared to historical vintages? Like, is there something you'd like to elaborate upon? I mean, it's building upon what Byron has mentioned earlier.
I remember tasting the samples, tasting the fruit, talking with the other people on our production team and saying this is the year that we really have to watch tannins. This is, the quality of tannin wasn't there, and we saw it not really soften, improve. The fruit character was really red, like Rob was saying, this year for Cabernet varieties. So we luckily have an optical sorter, which really helped to remove some of those shriveled berries. And so for me, that's where most of the harshness was coming from. We usually sort somewhere between 1% and 3% for our Bordeaux reds. This year it was 5 to 10%. So it was pretty significant. We were all, it was all about the quality of the fruit and not the quantity. This was not a year to think about quantity if you were a quality producer, I think. So that happened. We lowered our fermentation temperatures. We kind of snuck up via limiting the amount of pump overs we were doing, snuck up to the pressing. We did a cold soak in the beginning, 3 days, but mostly that was just to get the sugars dialed in, more than actually for tannin management. It seemed to work out well, though. I'm happy with our colors. I'm happy with our flavors. And pressing, we pressed early. We did a lot more whole berry even on our cabs. Pressed out, just a touch early. And really we're paying attention at the pressing as well. So that was me.
Christina, you want to elaborate on maceration?
Sure. The first few grapes that come in the winery, I think you're always kind of like, okay, well, we'll just taste and see. But it became really evident to me early season after the first couple ferments that, extended maceration, this was not the year for. So I lengthened my cold soaking time, and we don't do any crushing, so everything comes in whole berry, gravity fed to tank, so it does take a little bit of time to get any type of maceration. So I put that all up front in the fermentation. Cold soak, I actually elevated my temperature initially, but then brought it down significantly at the end of fermentation. Trying to get as much oxygen as possible into the fermentation as well in the beginning, because the tannins did seem very tight, very short mouthfeel, so trying to really expand out that mouthfeel. And then at the end, it was kind of like, okay, I can't do anything else. It's kind of the tannins were exhausted. I don't know, they were tired. From the Vivalese presentation about sugar loading, I would say that they were reactive, but for a very short amount of time, which was all very front-loaded. So typically I would use press fractions to really build out the palate. After tasting off on the first few presses, I ended up keeping everything separate in the end. Yeah.
I don't know if you want to comment or not on the winemaking.
I'll leave that to the people with a proper title.
Well, actually, I'd like to open the room to questions. I've been trying to lead some. Yes, please.
Did anybody utilize shade cloth? Was it detrimental or more effective?
So the question is, can you repeat the question?
Did any of us use shade cloth, and was it effective? I personally did not. We employ some shade canes, especially for our Petite Syrah, which seems to be really susceptible. So we actually pull cane, and it works wonders. It really does, but not shade cloth.
I didn't.
We did not use shade cloth, so we did, shift gears with our canopy management as the vintage progressed, and that first Father's Day heat spike kind of really got my attention. One of the things we did in our VSP canopies that really we found helpful was we did do some leafing on the morning sun side, but as we did that, we took the lower wire and pulled it all the way down, and that allowed the leaves above the fruit zone to spring out a little bit and provide more shade. So it's not shade cloth, but it's just using, you know, the conditions in the field to kind of get there.
Any other questions?
Everybody's hungry.
Yeah. Well, maybe I have one last one before to break. I wanted to hear your response regarding this idea that some varietals, particularly the later one in the case of late season heat spikes, are going to show a decoupling between phenolics and sugar maturity. I want to hear about you. Like, do you observe that, or are you in disagreement with those observations? How has been your management of sugar loading in order to assess phenolics maturity? Is it a proxy, not a proxy? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, for us, I think, you know, we definitely did see, particularly in our, you know, I was describing earlier two different kind of scenarios with blocks and rootstock combinations. In the lighter soils and the more riparian-based rootstocks, we did see more of a kind of an extreme decoupling. And you can only sort of wait so long with sugar accumulation to a certain point, and those blocks did come in earlier. Some of our later ripening varietals are also on rupestris rootstocks, and those blocks tend to do quite better, not just physically, but in terms of, you know, anthocyanin accumulation over time. So it you know, variability within the vineyards.
Nice. Christina, would you like to comment on the
Yeah,
observations?
I actually monitor sugar loading on the majority of my blocks. This year, that information, although it was coming to me, I wasn't looking at it as much as the volume loss. And I was thinking, as Rob Davis was talking about the desiccated clusters, I'm like, how many of those berries ended up in my samples that, you know, we were monitoring volume, because that could have also skewed a lot of the sugar loading results that I was looking at. Of course, there were clusters that were completely desiccated, but then there were clusters with, you know, some berries that were more shriveled than others. So I was wondering about that. But I had, I would say, during harvest, those sugar loading curves kind of became relevant just because I was so concerned about the volume loss, and I was looking more at that and just being out in the vineyard. Now that the harvest is over, I like to look at those sugar loading curves to more see how each block behaved differently, more of as a diagnostic tool.
Sure.
To see how each of the blocks reacted to the heat
Okay,
event.
so that you perceive clearly the effect of heat on those maturity. What about you, Jen?
Well, I think it was mixed bag. I mean, for us, and we don't measure, but yeah, I think we saw it kind of a mixed bag,
Okay.
depending on the vineyard. So I have a question. Micro sprinklers, do you have any of those,
We
Ned?
don't, though. When Rob mentioned those earlier, that it does sound like, you know, that's an attractive idea. I mean, because, you know, just to keep things cool.
Yes. So on micro sprinklers, I was part of a study. We tried to understand what's the most efficient way to use micro sprinklers. Should you use them continuously? Is it better to have pulse? And if pulse is having the same effects, what should be the frequency of the pulse? What should be the duration of pulse? And some of the results have been published in 2017 in the Australian Journal. And at the end of the day, what surprised me is that a 20-second pulse every 10 minutes has the same effect than a continuous pulse. So we could actually shift a little bit the way we think about using water in vineyards. Instead of using water to re-wet the root system, at least on deeper root site situations, maybe we should look at mitigating high vapor pressure deficit by watering the atmosphere. And if we are talking about 20 seconds every 10 minutes, maybe it's a better way of using water to keep the integrity of the crop. And I think it's a shift in how to use water. It's maybe not so important to combat the lack of moisture in the root system late season, particularly because the plant needs less water, and maybe more efficient from a production standpoint to combat the negative effect of severe water deficit. So in the air. So I leave that question open, but it seems to be an interesting alley to explore, and instead of irrigating the roots, irrigating the leaves, so to speak, might be interesting.
And a question to kind of follow up on that. Do you think the benefit would be to lower the water, the irrigation, but also the temperature within the fruit zone or the humidity?
Yeah, so it will be very counterintuitive, but the main benefit is you lower VPD, and by putting more moisture in the air, you lower vine water use. So it's counterintuitive because you think that you're going to boost water use, but in fact, VPD can increase fourfold. A high VPD for the same level of light can triple or quadruple the amount of water loss. So by putting more moisture in the air, you're lowering vine water consumption. So it's a bit counterintuitive, but through VPD, you make more water available around the fruit zone. So the temperature fluctuations are a little bit more buffered because there is more air moisture, but you are also lowering the amount of daily water consumption. So therefore, you're keeping more moisture into your plant tissue. So that's through VPD, I think is so not only are you lowering maximum temperature, you're also affecting the water vapor environment. Does that? Yeah. All right, there is one last question, and we.
The equivalent of a ton of refrigeration. So it takes almost no water to cool a canopy.
Absolutely. And that's how 20 seconds of mist can have a 10 minutes effect. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Matt, and then that's the last. Yes, go ahead.
Is there a VPD threshold that you triggered that microsprinkler policy?
Yes, so it's varietal dependent. I mean, that's a question. To give an in-depth question, we will need to elaborate beyond the scope of this discussion. But essentially, you have varietals like Merlot, Petit Verdot that are a little bit more sensitive, and you need to lower the vapor pressure deficit at which you start misting. But for Cabernet Sauvignon, Grenache varietals, or Shiraz also. Shiraz belongs to the first group of early VPD trigger. For Cabernet Sauvignon, Grenache, we trigger at higher vapor pressure deficit values. But that ties onto plant resilience to cavitation and fruit susceptibility to heat. So I'm happy to keep that conversation going, or maybe bring it on a different vintage report, but it's that's essentially what we are monitoring with SAPFlow. The SAPFlow tells us where to refine these thresholds at which we should mist. Well, thank you very much, and I hope the conversation keeps going. And to end up the session today, the elephant in the room, the fires, are now going to be analyzed thanks to Eric. So thank you, Eric, because you've been coming and supporting us to so many vintage reports, but I think it's important to see what ETS Labs has analyzed and hopefully know if in the future we have more fires, what to do best. So thank you.
Thank you, Thibault. Okay, thank you, Thibault. I just flew back from visiting my family in the Midwest yesterday, so sorry if I feel asleep.